understand what's going on around you. You are in a state of war, and you have precious little time to save yourself. It's a slow process, which we call active measures. What matters is essentials: economy, foreign relations, defense systems. With a violent change of power, structure, and economy, period of normalization. This is what will happen in the United States if you allow all these schmucks to put a big brother government in Washington, D.C., who will promise lots of things, never mind whether the promises are fulfilled or not. The disaster is coming closer and closer. The danger is real.
There is another very important phase of warfare. It has as its target not the body, but the mind of the enemy.
The target of psychological warfare is against the enemy's mind.
It is words and ideas.
The ammunition used by PsyWar.
SOP is a critical element to the overall RSOF mission. RSOF's main mission being unconventional warfare. It's very hard to have a resistance movement without that propaganda call coming out and recruiting that G-force to come in and train with you. So it's the critical first step in information warfare before you get to any type of decisive action. And we're seeing the same thing in multi-domain operations and near-peer threats, that information warfare comes first before actual warfare.
So the easiest way for me to describe psychological operations and what I do on the tactical side is trying to get a desired effect from either an enemy force or from a friendly force that is going to help us achieve kinetic effects using non-kinetic means.
And that behavior change takes place through a matter of weeks, months, years, typically. It's a usually mid to long-term process, and the techniques we use to influence that population range across a very broad spectrum. Some of those are your standard, media or mixed media type of products. It may be paper, it may be face-to-face engagement, maybe radio broadcasts, looking for cultural change or social change, specifically volatile areas of the world that we work in.
And the thing I would say I enjoy most about psychological operations is like the opportunity. Traveled, learned another language, so I've already been to multiple countries.
As a detachment commander, I had complete autonomy to run my detachment the way that I saw fit to prepare us for our deployments. And I really liked that small team mentality and working with a small group of guys that, you did everything together.
While in the infantry, I enjoyed my time, but I was always curious what else was out there. When I was in school, I was a marketing major, and so I always had a desire to do that as well. And I was really looking for a way to connect my desire for marketing as well as my desire to join the military, and I saw psychological operations as a way to do that.
I measure success in psychological operations on the effects that you generate. Are you actually generating an effect? Are you a contributing member to that team? And did that team ultimately accomplish something positive in that country? That's how I measure it. It's not really the PT test. It's not, well, how good you shoot or if you got your bachelor's degree while in service. Those things are just little events or little markers in your career, but real success is, did you have an impact on that individual that changed their life, perhaps? That's where it's at.
Here in the United States, we're often brought up and told we don't have propaganda, that we have a hard-charging investigative press, we have this educated, skeptical, even cynical citizenry, and that if there were powerful interests trying to manage and manipulate public opinion, they would be exposed. The reality actually is just the opposite. Academics like Alex Carey and others who've spent their lifetimes looking at how propaganda works finds that it's actually in Western democracies and open societies where you need the most sophisticated sorts of propaganda. And since World War I, thanks to people like Ivy Lee and Eddie Bernays, propaganda has become a business, this business of public relations. Or as one of the firms that has often represented dictators, the Burson-Marsteller firm puts it, their business is perception management, to manage public perception, public policy on behalf of their clients, whoever they might be.
April 9th, 2003. Throngs of Iraqis spontaneously attack a statue of Saddam Hussein, the face obscured with Old Glory. Later, the stars and stripes are replaced with red, white, and black, symbolizing the transference of power from the liberators to the liberated. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld describes the scenes as breathtaking. For the British Army, they are historic. BBC Radio calls them amazing, and they were, because the entire event was staged. Years after the operation, a U.S. Army report admitted that the toppling of the Saddam statue had been engineered by a psychological operations group. The document states, "Our TPT, or Tactical PSYOP team, saw the statue as a target of opportunity." A week earlier, another psychological operation laid the groundwork for what followed. The script was for a female Rambo turned damsel in distress to be rescued by U.S. armed forces.
In the situation that we're talking about here with Private Lynch, as you know, on about the 23rd of March, her 507th Maintenance Company was ambushed. A number of the members of that maintenance company were killed, a number captured, and a number were unaccounted for, she being one of them.
We waited 24 hours to get the cameras there to set up the whole thing to make this big rescue, and the SWAT team goes in to save her, and then she becomes an instant celebrity overnight. That story happened the same day that the tanks were rolling into Baghdad. That's the same day that we shelled the Palestine hotel where the independent journalists were. The same day we blew up Al Jazeera's television station. And killed one of their journalists. Well, what we're getting on the front pages of the papers and in the news is the rescue of Jessica Lynch. So that was a PR substitute story. Toppling of the Saddam statue, they got Shalabi's group. The Rennan group had actually formed them. The CIA had paid the Rennan group to form the Iraqi Congress as a counter group to Saddam Hussein, and they were based here in the U.S. Then they flew them over there and they shipped them into Iraq. They were the ones that were standing around the statue as, a tank was used to pull it over. The Rennan group had been around. He worked for George W.'s father. And he worked for Clinton, too. His firm, he used to be a public relations press guy for Carter. And he created a PR firm that specialized in war.
The head of the Rendon Group, John Rendon, denies that he is a national security strategist or a military tactician. Rather, he states, "I am a politician and a person who uses communication to meet public policy or corporate policy objectives. In fact, I am an information warrior and a perception manager." Following the first Gulf War, Rendon was paid $23 million by the CIA to create anti-Saddam propaganda. Following 9/11, he was charged with public relations for the U.S. bombing of Afghanistan. Rendon is far from alone. Public relations has mushroomed into a $200 billion a year industry, with PR flacks in the United States now outnumbering journalists. Propaganda has become the primary means by which the wealthy communicate with the rest of society. Whether selling a product, a political candidate, a law, or a war, seldom do the powerful deliver messages to the public before consulting their colleagues in the public relations industry. Colin Powell presents a now typical case. He didn't choose a seasoned diplomat for the position of Undersecretary of State. Instead, he chose Charlotte Beers, known in PR circles as the Queen of Madison Avenue. Her resume includes successful advertising campaigns for Head & Shoulders Dander Shampoo, Uncle Ben's Rice, and now, Uncle Sam.
You see a news show, you watch 60 Minutes or a Fox program or whatever it is, you tend to give more credibility to what you're told is journalism. If an advertisement comes on, hopefully you tend to be more skeptical of that because obviously somebody put an awful lot of money into crafting this slick TV ad and airing it. But what you probably never suspect is that that news story you just watched was also crafted by a company given to the TV station or network with the understanding that they would put their own logos on it, identify it as real journalism, and air it.
Colonel Sam Gardner would eventually chart 50 false news stories created and leaked by the Bush White House propaganda apparatus prior to and during the assault on Iraq. Foremost amongst these were the lies that led to the war in the first place. It was not bad intelligence that led to the invasion, concludes Gardner. It was an orchestrated effort that began before the war and was meticulously planned to manipulate the public.
In 2002, when the Bush administration was conducting its massive public relations campaign to sell the war, out of Donald Rumsfeld's office in the Pentagon, there was something now referred to as the Pentagon Pundits Program, where literally scores of former high-ranking military generals and admirals and colonels were getting their talking points for their appearances on TV news shows directly from the Pentagon. They would literally go to the Pentagon, be on phone conferences with the Pentagon, travel with the Pentagon, and then go on TV as supposedly independent sources. Although most of them were actually being paid in the private sector because these are retired military officials by defense contractors, and many of them were actually registered lobbyists for military contractors. So there's a bit of a conflict of interest right away when your bread and butter is based on being able to sell armaments and bombs and missiles, and you're supposed to be just a patriotic ex-general giving an honest opinion of what's going on. And even though that's illegal, there's no way to really stop it. And the most powerful medium through which it occurred refuses to even report on the scandal. You've got just a massive problem, and that's where we're at.
There were clear warning signs long before the age of the embed. During the assault on Serbia under President Clinton, a report emerged by the Dutch journalist Abe de Vries, revealing the presence of Psi warriors working at CNN. They derived from the 3rd Psychological Operations Battalion at Fort Bragg in North Carolina. De Vries quoted Major Thomas Collins of the U.S. Army Information Service. PSYOPs personnel, soldiers, and officers have been working in CNN's headquarters in Atlanta through our program, training with industry. They helped in the production of news. What made the Iraq War different were not so much the tactics or even the scale, but the high-tech synergy. It was almost impossible to tell where the state ended and the Fourth Estate began.
One of the things that we don't want to do is to destroy the infrastructure of Iraq, because in a few days we're going to own that country.
Should they have used more? Should they, use a Moab, the mother of all bombs, and a few daisy cutters, and, let's not just stop at a couple of cruise missiles.
only 40, The invasion of Iraq represents a pinnacle of domestic Psi war in the United States, an unparalleled integration between public relations firms, corporate media, and military PSYOPs. At the time of the assault, large segments of the American public were convinced that a nuclear attack by Saddam Hussein on their nation was not only possible, but imminent. Soldiers who comprised the invading force were similarly confused, with a remarkable 77% believing that Hussein was responsible for the attacks of 9/11. Many earnestly believed that the mission was to destroy a mysterious group known as Al-Qaeda, while bringing freedom to the Iraqi people.
We're here for your fucking freedom, so back up right now!
Yet what was actually happening was what the Nuremberg Charter describes as the single greatest crime under international law: the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war of aggression. Seven years later, the results of the invasion are clear. According to The Lancet, one of Britain's most respected medical journals, approximately 600,000 Iraqis had been killed from the invasion as of 2006. By 2009, a polling agency put the number at over 1 million. 4 million Iraqis have been made refugees in their own country. Their entire society is shattered. How did the land of the free and the home of the brave arrive at a place where citizens could be manipulated with such efficiency and on such a massive scale? Our story begins in an unlikely place, a coal mine. When we think of public relations, this is not an image that springs to mind. Yet it was here, at the turn of the century, in the town of Ludlow, Colorado, that PR as we know it began to take shape. From the beginning, it was steeped in class warfare.
The conditions that men, women, and children worked under in 19th century America were very much like what we think of now as the conditions in the global South, in which 13, 14-hour days were not uncommon. Living conditions were often in barrack-like housing. Children worked right alongside their parents. Those were the kind of conditions, and certainly if you picture what we see in the global South today, almost slave-like conditions, you can make the comparison pretty easily.
Like workers in most other industries at the time, the coal miners in the town of Ludlow were organizing to win basic rights. In 1914, the United Mine Workers Union called for coal companies to grant safe working conditions, tolerable wages, and compliance with state mining laws. In response, a labor organizer at Ludlow was shot to death by gunmen working for the Colorado Fuel and Iron Corporation, owned by the Rockefeller family. Then as now, the Rockefellers were synonymous with wealth and power. William Avery Rockefeller had made a living as a literal snake oil salesman, but his son, John Davidson, had achieved the American dream. His fortune was built by exploiting oil reserves in Mexico and the United States. John Davidson Rockefeller was America's first billionaire, but it was his son, John D. Jr., who would define the Rockefeller legacy in the 20th century. 24 hours after striking workers and their families celebrated Easter, the end came. It became known as the Ludlow Massacre.
The strike went on from the fall of 1913 to the spring of 1914, and they still couldn't break the strike. The strikers were living in tent colonies set up by their union, the United Mine Workers. And in April of 1914, the National Guard, which at this time was being paid by the Rockefellers, National Guard, attacked the tent colony. Men, women, children, killed many people, set the tents afire. They found the next day the bodies of 11 children and 2 women who were burned, suffocated to death in that fire. That was called the Ludlow Massacre.
A brief glance at events prior to Ludlow reveals that the brutalization of workers in the United States was not an unusual occurrence. 60 years earlier, in 1847, a nationwide general strike was met with violent oppression by federal troops. Over 30 workers were killed and 100 wounded at the Battle of the Viaduct in Chicago. In 1894, federal troops killed 34 American Railway Union members, also in the Chicago area. The troops were attempting to break a strike led by Eugene Debs against the Pullman Company. In 1897, 19 unarmed coal miners were killed and 36 wounded by a posse organized by a sheriff near Latimer, Pennsylvania. Most of the workers were shot in the back while attempting to flee. The worldview of the great capitalists at the turn of the century can be summed up in the words of William Vanderbilt. In response to a suggestion that the New York Central Railroad should adjust its train schedules to accommodate the public, he replied, "The public be damned." But the relationship between the public and corporations was changing. Decades of organizing and rebellion had given rise to a vast network of labor groups with increasing political power. Over time, these included the Grange Movement, the Socialist Party, the Greenbackers, the Populists, and Progressives, and perhaps most significantly, the anarchist union known as the Industrial Workers of the World, or the Wobblies. Following the massacre at Ludlow, soldiers in Denver refused to participate in further attacks against the miners, declaring that they would not engage in the shooting of women and children. Demonstrations erupted across the country. A march occurred in front of the Rockefeller offices in New York City. A clergyman protested outside a church where Rockefeller liked to give sermons, only to be beaten by police. In modern parlance, it was a PR nightmare.
Ivy Lee went to work for, among other clients, the Rockefellers. The Rockefeller family, after the Ludlow massacre, used Eddie Lee to manage the public perception around that event and other events. Ivy Lee's specialty was crisis management. Among other things, he's credited with inventing the press release, which, all of us just sort of think of as something helpful. You want to publicize an event, a church picnic, call a news conference, you put out a press release. But at the time, the idea was very radical because what Ivy Lee was saying is, well, we're going to manage this crisis by calling attention to it. We're going to actually assist and help the news media and journalists in covering it. What he knew was that the degree to which journalists became used to and dependent on his services was a degree to which he could actually cultivate and manage coverage.
Lee began by waging a disinformation campaign. He put out news bulletins claiming that the 2 women and 11 children at Ludlow had not been killed by militia, but by an overturned stove. He circulated stories suggesting that Mother Jones, in addition to being a labor organizer, was a madam who ran a bordello. He ghost-wrote letters to the governor and even to President Wilson. Lee's techniques achieved little success, in part because he himself had become a highly visible figure. In future, PR experts would learn that their techniques are rarely effective unless practiced in the dark. Yet one of Lee's innovations was epoch-making. Upon learning that the Rockefeller Foundation had $100 million set aside for promotional purposes, he convinced Rockefeller to donate large sums to colleges, hospitals, churches, and charitable organizations in order to generate positive publicity. He also suggested that Rockefeller Sr. begin handing out money in public and that Jr. appear in staged photo ops at work sites. What Ivy Lee understood was that the corporation needed a makeover. Widely perceived as greedy, tyrannical institutions, corporations needed to manufacture an image of warmth and caring.
This is the beginning of the public relations industry. Rockefeller didn't set up the Rockefeller Foundation until Rockefeller became very unpopular because of his labor policies. And suddenly Rockefeller needed to create a good impression.
Well, it's an interesting phenomenon that the poor actually give a larger percentage of their income than the rich. I think the rich feel that they're doing more because, you know, giving $100,000 seems like a substantial kind of donation, and you know, it doesn't matter that they have 100 million. They still think, well, they've done quite a lot. So it's partly a result of this distortion of economic values, and it's partly a result of being cheap. You know, I mean, people don't want to give away their wealth, Ted Turner said, because they're afraid their status in the Forbes 400 is going to go down that little bit. So they give it away when it's prudent or when it's beneficial, when they can get some displayed benefit out of it, or when it can give them access to a different sort of social class or a different group that they want to be part of. But they have a more functional view of their wealth rather than a strictly charitable view.
Charity, and private charity, and you might say government charity. Any kind of action that sort of relieves people's distress a little bit without changing the system maintains the system. In fact, that is the way the American system, which is very exploitative and very unfair, that's the way the American system has been maintained for all these centuries, really, by giving people a little bit and giving enough people, just enough, to prevent them from breaking out in open rebellion.
Today, one of the largest PR firms in the world specializes in the art of crisis management. Burson Marsteller holds offices in 35 countries and has served clients as varied as cigarette maker Philip Morris, chemical giant Union Carbide, and the Monsanto Corporation, a company specializing in genetic engineering and other life sciences. Like the Rendon Group, Burson Marsteller is bipartisan to the core. Its worldwide president and chief executive, Mark Penn, served as Hillary Clinton's key political advisor during the 2008 election. The most disturbing facet of Burson Marsteller is its willingness to work with the world's worst human rights violators. They ran PR for the Indonesian government as it committed genocide in East Timor. They worked closely with the Nigerian government and Royal Dutch Shell during and after the Biafran War in Nigeria, and they helped to improve the image of a US-backed Argentine military junta led by General Jorge Videla.
One of their clients in the 1970s was the brutal Argentine junta, which had taken control of the government there and was rounding up dissidents, systematically torturing, beating, killing people, and flying out over the ocean and dumping bodies. Not a really good public image. So the Burson Marsteller firm was used by Argentina, hired by Argentina, and went to work for them quite happily under a FAT contract to improve the image of Argentina in the international financial community and in the Western press.
In some ways, it should not be surprising that public relations has evolved into companies like Burson Marsteller and the Rendon Group. Looking back at the career of its first guru, we find a remarkably similar pattern.
Ivy Lee went to work for the IG Farben company, a big German industrial company, and we know now that IG Farben was actually part of the Nazi propaganda inner circle. One of the most effective and, of course, horrifying government propaganda campaigns ever organized was the Nazi campaign that continued for years and years under the direction of Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels. And IG Farben paid Ivy Lee and also paid Ivy Lee's son to represent not just their interests, but the interests of Nazi Germany in an effort to paint the Nazi regime as being a friendly regime.
But before lending his expertise to the Third Reich, Mr. Lee would do so for the American government. Along with other experts in the burgeoning field of mind science and public relations, he would engineer propaganda for World War I, not just against the enemy, the Germans, but against the American people themselves.
We often talk about propaganda being relatively recent, but of course it isn't. Even in ancient societies that weren't democratic, especially large states, it was understood by elites that if you don't have the support of the people, you could be in trouble. And so a fair bit of attention was actually given to legitimizing military adventures. I'm remembering here a passage from an old Chinese text, I think it's Han Fei, so it would be about 2,300 years ago, where the author of the book says, in general, and I'm quoting now, in general, war is a thing that the people despise. Therefore, when a young man is to be sent off to war, his wife, his parents, his family should gather around him and say to him, conquer, or let me never see you again. And this is a very powerful sense of, well, first of all, the violence done to that young man, but also of the sense that war is disgusting to most people, and it is often not in their best interest, and therefore one needs all kinds of songs and dances. And in this case, threatening the young man essentially with dispossession. You can't return to your family, you can't return home, you'll be disgraced, honor, security, everything is being played upon her. And it continues. So yeah, national security is one of the most powerful notions in modern times. To swindle, I think, people to do things that are not in their best interest, and to support massive military complexes that are not in anybody's interest, but that are like cancers feeding on society frequently.
Propaganda and persuasion have been around for centuries, eons, but propaganda in its modern sense can be traced to the 15th and 16th century when the Catholic Church was in a tough competition with the Protestants over how to articulate a religious vision for the world. And the reason that I mention this is that it shows that propaganda is about mindset. It's about ideology. It's about worldview, how people see things, as distinct from an individual policy or whether you happen to like this candidate or that candidate. So that's where the word came from, for propagating the faith. And that's the way the word was used up until the early 20th century. And then what emerged, particularly with World War I, was the application of this propagating the faith to refer to international affairs, to refer to what a national government would do, a national security policy. In the run-up to World War I and during World War I, what one saw on the geopolitical stage was a crisis of empires. Empires were disintegrating, they were falling apart. The British Empire seemed extremely strong at that time, and yet nevertheless was in a downward phase. It couldn't afford to support its own army, for example. Same with the French. Same with the Austro-Hungarians. Same with the Russians, the Tsarist Empire. Same with the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and so on around the world. When that war was underway, most particularly the United Kingdom came up with an office whose specific purpose was promoting the war aims of the United Kingdom, the English, through publicity, through covert operations, through what would today be called dirty tricks, through telling the truth, through a whole number of different applications of information, using information as an instrument of war. And from the get-go, from the very beginning, it was both aimed at the enemy and aimed at the home population.
The Creel Commission was the American variant of it. Woodrow Wilson came into office in 1916 with the slogan, "Peace without victory." He said, what we want is an end to World War I. Neither side deserves their support, and the population didn't want to enter the war.
In America, 1916 was an election year. The war was the dominant issue. The election campaigns of the parties crystallized the sway of opinion. Neutralism, the profound wish to stay out of the war, still possessed a doughty champion in the president. Support for Wilson's policy was strong in the Middle West and Pacific states. Europe's war seemed more remote there than on the Atlantic seaboard. At the Democratic Convention, Wilson was renominated presidential candidate. The chairman opened his speech with a text from the Sermon on the Mount.
Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God.
Within a couple of months, Wilson was talking about victory without peace. And you had to somehow drive the population into accepting this sharp change of policy, the opposite of what they voted for. And that's where the Creel Commission came in.
George Creel described his work with unabashed enthusiasm. It was a plain publicity proposition, a vast enterprise in salesmanship, the world's greatest adventure in advertising. 75,000 civil leaders, known as 4-Minute Men, were assembled to deliver pro-war messages to people in churches, theaters, and civic groups. Periodicals were sent to 600,000 teachers. Boy Scouts delivered copies of President Wilson's addresses to households across America. It was, in short, the largest wartime propaganda campaign in the history of the United States. Central to the committee's propaganda were two basic ideas. One, the American homeland was in imminent danger from a savage, bloodthirsty foe. And two, it was the fate of the American nation, in President Wilson's words, to make the world safe for democracy. The first theme was a time-honored tactic, long used in the United States and other countries, to vilify foreign enemies, indigenous peoples, and slaves. During the Great War, the savage Indian and the subhuman Negro would transform into the barbaric Hun. The caricature of the bloodthirsty Hun was bolstered by a series of fake news reports leaked by the new propaganda industry and disseminated to the public. Among them, the babies in Belgium had had their hands cut off, were being impaled on bayonets, and in one case, nailed to a door. That a Canadian had been crucified by German soldiers, and that dead bodies were being boiled down in so-called corpse factories to be used for ammunitions and pig food. In a foreshadowing of the Freedom Fries incident, sauerkraut was renamed Liberty Cabbage. False atrocity stories would become a staple for nations in wartime throughout the 20th century. A recent example occurred prior to the First Gulf War.
While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
As it turns out, the massacre of babes never occurred. The young girl was actually a member of the Kuwaiti royal family and had been coached by the public relations firm Hill and Knowlton to give persuasive false testimony.
Kids in incubators, and they were thrown out of the incubators so that
Kuwait could be systematically dismantled.
The attempt to engender hatred against Germans in support of the war effort was highly successful. But there was another, equally important aspect to the domestic propaganda campaign. If every adventure story needs a villain, it also needs a hero.
This is a song I made about when they was drafting the men. Uncle Sam say he traveled east and traveled west. Uncle Sam say he believe he know the best. Uncle Sam said, Uncle Sam said, Uncle Sam said, you got to bottle up and go. I'll travel the east.
Creel estimated that 72 million copies of 30 different booklets about American ideals were sent across the United States, with millions more sent abroad. In addition to influencing the minds of Europeans, the goal was to redefine for the home population the very concept of what it meant to be American. The new American would not interpret events from what Creel called a class or sectional standpoint, but rather as a unified collective. In this manner, the people could be herded into one white-hot mass instinct. Previously, military action by the United States had been justified under the pretense of maintaining order, protecting American interests, and bringing civilization to the savages. Now, the word civilization would transmute into democracy.
You don't have to hesitate, Uncle Sam say. You got it by love and go. Next number is called 192. Uncle Sam said, if you don't come, I'm going to talk.
Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian communications theorist, once said that if a fish could talk, and you could ask a fish, what's the most obvious element of your environment? The last thing that the fish would say would be water. That's the last thing the fish would notice. And it's true about any culture. Those things that are most powerful and most obvious to an outsider don't get seen by the people swimming in that water. Americans as God's chosen people. This goes back as far as back to 1630, where John Winthrop on the Arabella, coming from England to the United States, said we're a city on a hill. It's not an accident that in the campaign, debates and stumps of the recent candidates, yet Barack Obama actually saying that we are a city on a hill, as well as Sarah Palin. Ronald Reagan said it in his inaugural address.
I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it was a tall, proud city built on rocks stronger than oceans, windswept, God-blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds living in harmony and peace.
We're a city on a hill. And so our mission is to democratize the rest of the world. We've got the best system possible. And basically people ought to pay attention to us because we know.
The idea of a particular state cast as savior of the world would be taken to new heights in the United States. But it wasn't an American invention. The savior motif was used as a justification for virtually every imperial intervention during the colonial era. French leaders spoke of a civilizing mission in their new colonies. British leaders spoke of bringing progress in civilized government to India. Imperial Japan spoke of unleashing an earthly paradise in Asia, while the Third Reich dreamt of a worldwide utopia. A decade before World War I, Mark Twain stated that my kind of loyalty was loyalty to one's country, not to its institutions or its office holders. Decades later, George Orwell came to a similar conclusion, that patriotism is a devotion to a certain place and people, contrary to nationalism, which is inseparable from lust for power. This concept of patriotism remains elusive.
Once the war against Saddam begins, we expect every American to support our military, and if they can't do that, to shut up.
equating super patriotism with militarism, military endeavor, military achievements, military struggles and victories. That's all supposedly a special manifestation of super patriotism. And I argue that a real patriot wants something different for his country. He wants social justice, he wants peace and stability, he wants fairness, he wants an end to racism and sexism. He takes pride in his country's ability at social betterment rather than his country's ability to invade and knock around other countries. A real patriot feels an attachment to his country, but not at the expense of other countries. He or she may feel a special attachment to the history of his own country. He values the accomplishments of his country, like the abolition of slavery, emergence of collective bargaining, and the rights of working people for a better life, the gains made by women in terms of being able to get into public life. These are the kind of things that the real patriot would value.
In October 2001, George W. Bush signed into law what civil libertarians characterized as an all-out assault against the Bill of Rights. It was called the Patriot Act. During the Great War, similar bills were passed. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act, passed a year later, authorized huge fines and lengthy prison terms for anyone who obstructed the military draft or encouraged what was termed disloyalty to the state. The sweeping legislation was quickly put into effect. And first on the list were the Wobblies.
In many ways, the Wobblies were the most impressive example of a union movement in the history of the U.S. working class. Wobblies was the nickname for an organization called the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, which flourished in the first decade and a half of the 20th century. The American Federation of Labor, which was the main craft union at the time, refused to organize African Americans, immigrants, and women workers. So that meant excluding the vast majority of the working class from the union movement. Along come the Wobblies, and they set out from the beginning specifically to organize immigrants, women, African Americans alongside white workers in what they called one big union. They led some of the most successful strikes. One of their strikes was the first sit-down strike at the time. Women workers played leadership roles, something that was absolutely unheard of at the time. Their philosophy was a revolutionary philosophy. It's known as anarcho-syndicalism.
A federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as anarcho-syndicalism, and it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in a machine.
On September 5th, 1917, federal agents raided offices of the Wobblies across the nation, leading to arrests for the offense of causing insubordination, disloyalty, and refusal of duty in the military and naval forces. 101 of the defendants were found guilty and received prison sentences up to 20 years.
Wilson carried out a brutal internal repression called the Red Scare, which is the worst in American history, far worse than McCarthy, far worse than anything that's going on now. They arrested thousands of people, smashed the labor movement, heavy constraints on free expression, threw lots of people in jail, expelled all sorts of people from the country.
Yet what had started as a hunt against radicals soon spread to every corner of American society. Patriots were encouraged to inform on friends and neighbors who spoke out against the war, while surveillance increased dramatically, not only by the military, but by seemingly benign institutions like the postal system.
The state flourishes in time of war. The state goes stronger in time of war. The state accumulates power. The military is enhanced. The forces of repression are enhanced. War is an opportunity for the government to grow in power.
By the time the war ended, the total number of deaths had reached approximately 9.7 million soldiers, with millions more suffering life-changing injuries and severe post-traumatic stress. To what end was not clear. The massive bloodshed had not made the world safe for freedom and democracy. What it had done was produce enormous fortunes for a handful of corporations and banks, while leaving the worldwide labor movement in disarray. If the Great War had been a test of the Constitution and the concept of balancing the powers by each other, it failed. The United States Supreme Court, established in Schenck versus United States and Abrams versus United States, that the federal government could suspend constitutional rights when the nation faced, quote, a clear and present danger. Randolph Bourne, speaking of the Great War as a whole, responded preemptively with a now famous dictum. War, he said, is the health of the state.
The definition of polyarchy that we have in the social sciences is a system where the participation of masses of people is limited to voting among one or another representatives of the elite in periodic elections. And in between elections, the masses are now expected to keep quiet, to go back to life as usual, while the elite make the decisions and run the world until they can choose between one or another elite another 4 years later. So really, polyarchy is a system of elite rule, and a system of elite rule which is a little more softcore than the type of elite rule that we would see under a military dictatorship, for instance. But what we see is that under a polyarchy, the basic socioeconomic system does not change. It does not become democratized. Wealth is not redistributed downward. You don't see a more equitable redistribution of wealth and resources. So that's the key. Socioeconomic dictatorship and free elections. That's the prescription for polyarchy. Participatory democracy would see not only more participation of people in the running of their daily affairs, but it would see a democratization of the economy, democratization of social relations.
In the 20th century, you can't really talk openly about rule by the rich. That doesn't sound nice. The devices that have been developed, propaganda devices, are ruled by the more competent, the technocratic elite, the responsible people, the educated sectors. There's a huge literature on this, but maybe the primary source for the 20th century is the leading public intellectual of the 20th century in the United States, Walter Lippmann, highly respected commentator on public affairs, also a theorist of democracy.
During World War I, people who later emerged as sort of the founding fathers of modern communication research, modern communication applications, mass media applications. Quite a number of them had worked as propagandists during World War I, often as relatively young people who were shaping their own ideas at the time. One of them was Walter Lippmann, and Lippmann has emerged really to this day as a leading intellectual light of a particular way of looking at society.
Today, Walter Lippmann is known as the Dean of American Journalism. Yet during the Great War, he had been chief leaflet writer and editor of a U.S. propaganda unit. He also served as secretary of the Inquiry, a quasi-intelligence agency. Before dealing with Lippmann's contributions to political theory, we first have to understand the forms of democracy that have characterized the United States and other Western nations since the age of the Great Revolutions. A leap forward from the age of monarchy, the new nation-states would nevertheless preserve the concept that wealthy elites had the right to rule over the mass of the population.
Well, it's done me a sight of good coming forward in time like this. to see how wonderful things have turned out. But I wish I could take you back with me. Back in time. Back those 200 years when we were starting as a nation. I wish you could have seen this country then.
George Washington was a slave owner. James Madison was a slave owner. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. Importantly, Jefferson, who was the most democratic of the lot, wasn't at the Philadelphia Convention. He was ambassador to France, and he picked up a lot of radical ideas from the French Revolution, which didn't exactly endear him to people like Alexander Hamilton. The initial divide in American politics then goes back to those roots. It's Jeffersonian Democrats against Federalists, the leader of whom, until he was killed by Burr, was Alexander Hamilton. Essentially a class struggle, a class conflict. Thomas Jefferson was, in fact, a fairly radical democratic thinker in his time. And clearly the Declaration's statement that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, was a powerful democratic statement. And although Jefferson would not have applied it to women or to Indians or to blacks, nonetheless, in all of those cases, those words would come back to be very serviceable for those groups in pushing civil rights and civil liberties forward in the United States from where Jefferson's statement left them. The problem with the Declaration of Independence was that once independence was won from Britain, then the question became one of governance. How were these former colonies of Britain to govern? What led immediately to the Constitutional Convention in 1787 were a series of uprisings by debtors, essentially, not just in Massachusetts. The most famous is, of course, the Shays Rebellion in 1786.
The American state was founded largely to get the Ohio Valley, largely to cross the Appalachians. That is the Constitution, to organize an army and money in order to conquer further lands more to the west. That's the origin of the USA. But to do that, the slave masters are not going to do the fighting. What they will do is hire poor people to do it. But when they don't pay the poor people, as they didn't pay Daniel Shays takes matters into his own hand in 1787 and goes to the courts and shuts down the courts because the courts were beginning to foreclose on the grounds that Daniel Shays and the other veterans from the American War of Independence did not have the money to pay back.
Debtor riots were happening throughout the 1780s, and they were sufficiently scary from the point of view of people with property that they had to do something about it. And what they did about it was essentially overthrow the Articles of Confederation and instill a much stronger, much more able government to protect the property interests that were in dire threat from the people, quote unquote. This was an elitist, you could almost say coup d'etat, except there wasn't any strong central government to launch a coup against. They were really trying to set one up and protect it against majoritarian interests, especially economic interests, especially property interests, especially threats from people who didn't have much. First thing they did when they got to Philadelphia in 1787 was they locked the doors. The only reason we know what happened behind those closed doors were that people like James Madison kept extensive notes.
The American Constitution was formulated primarily by James Madison. He's the major framer of the Constitution, and he wanted to overcome what he called the tyranny of the majority. He said a primary goal of government is to ensure that the opulent are protected from the majority. So therefore he designed the Constitution in such a way that, as he put it, the wealth of the nation will be in charge. The more responsible set of men, those who sympathize with property owners and their rights, And the system was designed that way. Power was in the Senate, which was the least representative body, and it was the wealth of the nation. In fact, it still is. The House of Representatives, which is more democratic, in theory, was given much less power. And the powerful executive is also supposed to represent the wealth of the nation. In Madison's defense, one should say that he was really pre-capitalist in his mentality. He assumed that the wealthy would be what he called benevolent gentlemen who would not be concerned with their own interests, but with the benefit of the people. Adam Smith, who preceded him, was much more realistic. He pointed out that the principal architects of policy, namely the merchants and manufacturers in his day, they ensure that policies are designed so that their own interests are protected, no matter how grievous the effect on others, including the people of England. It's rather interesting to compare Madison's thinking, which founded this country, with the first major book on politics, namely Aristotle's Politics. Aristotle surveyed many kinds of systems and decided that of all of them, didn't like any of them, but he said of all of them, democracy is probably the best. But he said that democracy has a problem, and it was the same problem that Madison noticed centuries later. He said if in Athens everyone had a right to vote, the poor majority would attack the property of the rich, insist that it be divided, and he also felt that was unfair. But Madison and Aristotle had opposite solutions. Madison's solution was to restrict democracy. Aristotle's solution was to restrict inequality.
Opponents of the new government were called anti-federalists, though the term is inaccurate. The majority favored some form of federation, but insisted on more localized control, with a more participatory democratic system.
The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, they were the price the Federalists had to pay in the ratifying conventions to pass the document. So the democratic element of the Constitution, which of course is the Bill of Rights, was forced down their throats. It didn't come out of Philadelphia at all. It was appended in 1791 and forced down on the Constitution by the more democratic elements in the society. Even with the Bill of Rights, we have a system which, is hardly perfect from the point of view of civil rights and civil liberties, let's put it mildly. They've trampled all over with the rights of citizens. So the Bill of Rights is hardly an ironclad set of guarantees for civil rights and civil liberties in the United States. I'd hate to think of the United States without it. The anti-federalists were significantly more partial to democratic elements in the society and to the rights of ordinary people than were the significantly more elitist federalists.
If the greatest legacy of the anti-federalists was the Bill of Rights, their dream of direct democracy was not to be. At the time, many dissidents made predictions for what they believed would come to pass as the new nation grew and flourished. The natural course of power is to make the many slaves to the few, one anti-federalist wrote. Another objected to the new government because the bulk of the people can have nothing to say to it. The government is not a government of the people. The men of fortune would not feel for the common people. An aristocratical tyranny would arise, in which the great will struggle for power, honor, and wealth. The poor become a prey to avarice, insolence, and oppression. In short, my fellow citizens, it can be said to be nothing less than a nasty stride to universal empire. A significant model for both the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were the Iroquois, who had created a highly sophisticated and democratic federation of self-governing units. In stark contrast to European forms of government, the Iroquois people had the ability to immediately remove corrupt leaders. Women played a significant role in decision-making. Everyone was permitted to participate in debate and policy formulation.
Native Americans were exceedingly democratic in the way they operated. No society is perfect,
When you make comparisons, you see that. They were sometimes small, but sometimes 30, 40,000 people and more in a large confederacy that operated on a basis of mutual respect. Mutual respect that developed out of experience, because if you didn't treat people equally, then they were going to give you trouble. Societies were exceedingly collaborative, but they were also exceedingly individualist. The individual was honored, but the values were collaborative because you had to get along. Everybody was included in every decision that affected them. Elders obviously were honored. They knew more. You listened to your elders, but everybody had a say. You have an extremely participatory society, and as it moved up to larger, there's a great deal of decentralization. So if you had a large number of people, and if they would be in a federation, the village would decide for itself. The tribe would then decide, but the individual villages would have to decide. Then the tribes in the federation, their representatives would meet. But they wouldn't decide for everyone. They'd have to have the consensus of local people. So if there wasn't consensus already, they would have to go back and discuss it. So that to the extent that there was representation, these were representatives who were truly representative. They would have to go back. They wouldn't keep their positions unless they consulted people. And they knew that. Even if they had the authority to make a decision, people would go elsewhere and not keep them as leaders if they didn't listen to them and they didn't treat them. By and large, you had a much more participatory society, and even on the larger, more representative level, the representatives really had to listen to their constituencies.
Ironically referred to as primitive and savage, Native Americans had actually created a far more democratic system of self-governance than any civilized nation in history. But their anarchic models, as well as the more limited democratic systems proposed by the Anti-Federalists, were incompatible with Madison's elitist vision. In republic and parliamentary democracy alike, citizens would be reduced to passive observers. They would be allowed to pick and choose which individual made decisions on their behalf, but they would not be able to make those decisions themselves. Returning to the period after the First World War, we find widespread support amongst intellectuals for Madison's elitist interpretation of democracy. According to Walter Lippmann, the public's function in politics was to be interested spectators of action, but not participants. Yet Lippmann perceived a problem. New technologies in communication and transportation had awakened millions of disenfranchised people to a new world outside their towns and cities, while traditional economic, political, and social structures remained in place. Something had to change. But rather than advocate structural changes in society's institutions, Lippmann suggested that propaganda readjust the public mind.
In his essays on democracy in the 1920s, which are incidentally called progressive essays on democracy, he was a Wilson, Roosevelt, Kennedy liberal in the American sense. He says that the majority are simply incompetent. They are ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, in his view. That's the majority of the population. And to allow them to participate in decision-making would be a complete disaster. So therefore we have to design means to ensure that what he called the responsible men, of whom he was of course one, are protected from the roar and the trampling of the beasts, the ignorant majority. And he devised a number of methods. Lippmann called it the manufacture of consent. We have to manufacture the consent of the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, mass of the population. And the huge public relations industry was developed at the same time. They are the people who manage and control the marketing exercises that are called elections in the United States. They are marketing exercises, and they're well aware of it.
Apparently we have all been wrong. It is pronounced California. Ladies and gentlemen, the governor of the great state of California, Arnold Schwarzenegger.
So, for example, in the last election, 2008, the advertising industry gives a prize every year for the best marketing campaign of the year. 2008, they gave it to the Obama campaign, who beat out commercial competitors. The idea is we market candidates the same way we market toothpaste or lifestyle drugs or automobiles. Of course, it helps to have a lot of money. And in fact, Obama greatly outspent McCain, and not because of popular contributions. It came mostly from financial industries. He was their candidate. And his policies will presumably respond to his constituency.
Prominent intellectuals continue to argue that the world's complexity makes democracy impossible. A recent cover story in Time magazine claimed that democracy is in the worst interest of national goals. The modern world is too complex to allow the man or woman in the street to interfere in its management. A man who surely would have agreed was Edward Bernays. Like Lippmann, Bernays served as a propagandist on the Creel Committee, and like Lippmann, he went on to refashion wartime propaganda for peacetime aims. In his classic text Propaganda, Bernays suggested that elites regiment the public mind every bit as much as an army regiments their bodies. Bernays considered mass mind control so crucial that it constituted, in his words, the very essence of the democratic process. Bernays' opportunity to shine arose when a crisis threatened not only the profits of major corporations, but the entire capitalist system. The solution, as theorized by business leaders, would lead to social breakdown, environmental catastrophe, and further alienation between the American people and their government. It would also lead to wealth on a scale never before imagined.
The major story that advertising tells us about human happiness is that the way through happiness is through the consumption of things. That in fact buying something in the marketplace will make you happy. In fact, that's the message of almost every single ad. And it's not often you can say that there is one message that is in the literally millions of ads that are produced every year. But I think that is the message. The message of advertising as a whole is that it's better to buy than not to buy. That in fact the way to become, and that you will be happier as a result of buying than not buying. And I think that idea, in fact, I think is the major force for global social change, over the last 50 years.
In the 1920s, business leaders were faced with a dilemma. Overproduction of goods had exceeded demand. Production between 1860 and 1920 had increased by 12 to 14 times, while the population only increased by a factor of 3. There were several ways of solving the problem. One was to reduce working hours and raise wages so that production and consumption reached an equilibrium. This would have led to more leisure time for workers and a higher standard of living. The problem with this solution is that it could have entailed a slight decrease in profits. Corporations are mandated by law to maximize profits on behalf of their shareholders, regardless of social or environmental costs. According to business leaders, there was another problem. John Egerton, president of the National Association of Manufacturers, warned that a shorter work week would undermine the work ethic and potentially foment radicalism. If people had time to stop and think, they might also take the time to rethink their position in life. The emphasis should be put on work, Egerton stated. More work and better work, instead of upon leisure. It seems a harmless enough statement, but what businessmen were advocating was revolutionary. Production would no longer be about satisfying human needs. It would be an end in and of itself. Rather than a democracy of ideas, or a democracy of mass participation, the United States would become a democracy of material goods. The citizen would be replaced by the consumer.
Look at those goods piled up over there. I'm worried. Here we are. We've got the new machines, and they're doing even better than we expected. They've not only cut production costs, But they've increased output over 50%. But we're not selling this additional product. Inventories are piling up. Now what are we going to do about it?
It seems to me we've got to change our plan completely. Now that we're increasing production, we've got to put on more pressure, work the territory more intensively.
You mean more advertising?
Yes.
The problem of capitalism is the problem of consumption. And the problem is that after your basic needs have been met, there is no real need for consumption. And so you have to convince people that, in fact, their identities are based upon the consumption of objects for which there is no material need. That's the problem that comes from the expansion of the market. If you look at advertising, it's a very interesting history. In the first period of advertising, we can say right up until about the 1920s, advertising talked about goods themselves. They talked about how they were made, what they did, how well they lasted, etc. It really is a discourse about objects, about what goods did. However, starting around 1920, that changes. And from that period on, advertising doesn't really talk about goods themselves. They talk about the relationship of goods to our needs.
At the center of the new strategy was Edward Bernays. If Walter Lippmann had concerned himself with an overarching analysis of mass media and democracy, Bernays would devote most of his energies to propaganda on behalf of the corporation. His uncle, Sigmund Freud, would serve as his muse. Rather than focus on the intrinsic worth of a particular product, Bernays suggested a strategy where products became linked with the unconscious desires of the public. In this manner, there would be virtually no limits to either production or consumption.
Freud's nephew was a man by the name of Bernays, and he's regarded as the father of modern public relations, particularly in the United States. His contribution, if you want to call it that, was to take propaganda techniques that had been developed for military, psychological warfare, national security type issues during World War I, and apply them in a systematic way to commercial issues. One of his best known efforts had to do with encouraging women to smoke. He would stage beauty pageants, he would stage what would today be called photo ops and that sort of thing, in which smoking by women was portrayed as women's liberation, was portrayed as a way to be free and empowered, is getting addicted to nicotine. The audience, the market, in Bernays' mind, had a clear desire to be free, to be stronger, to be more self-empowered. So women clearly wanted these things. Along comes Bernays in the tobacco industry and says, here is how to have it.
Goods don't make us very happy. Goods are not central to satisfaction. What actually really makes people happy are non-material things. What makes people happy seems to be things connected with sociability. I don't mean to say by that material things have nothing to do with happiness. Poor people are not happy. They don't have access to, to clean drinking water. They don't have access to food. They don't have access to shelter. So it's not that material things are not connected to happiness. They are to some degree. But once you get past a certain level of comfort, material things simply don't provide us happiness. And at the same time, there is this giant propaganda system of advertising that is, again, perpetually telling us that the way to happiness is through objects, the way to happiness is through consumption. What makes people happy are things to do with society, with connection, with personal connection, with autonomy, with relaxation. In fact, when you ask people what it is that makes them happy, goods very rarely come into it. However, the problem is that capitalism has to sell goods. The marketplace provides goods, and therefore what it did was it took the images of the life that people really want, which is a life of meaning, of connection, of sociability, of friendship, of family, of intimacy, of sexuality. Those are the images that it took, and it linked them to objects. And so advertising is both true and false at the same time. If it was simply false, it wouldn't work. But advertising is true to the extent that it reflects our real desires.
As bizarre as it may sound for people who dream of fantastic wealth as a cure for unhappiness, the same holds for the wealthy. Beyond a certain level of material comfort, deprivation is relative.
At the bottom level, sure, it's $5 million to $10 million a year. But once you've got 5 or 10 million, that doesn't seem like enough because you're associating with people who have 15 or 20. And when you get 15 or 20, then it's 50 and 100. And you wind up never feeling as if you have enough. And in fact, people really never even thought of themselves as rich, even when they were colossally rich, because of this phenomenon that psychologists call relative deprivation. They were comparing themselves not with you and me, but with each other in this little world that they'd come to inhabit.
In his book The Status Seekers, Vance Packard uses the phrase merchants of discontent to describe a deliberate strategy by advertisers of targeting the less affluent with status symbol messages. For someone with little chance of changing their social conditions in life, consumerism offers a quick fix that allows people to feel as though they are climbing the social hierarchy, when in fact they are standing still. The strategy was particularly evident in mid-century automobile advertising. Studies found the people who lived in housing developments were more likely to park their cars outside of the garage than those who could afford more expensive homes. A typical example is this advertisement from Plymouth. It reads, "We're not wealthy, we just look it." The American way of life would be characterized by a myth which would seem to make political activism unnecessary. In the new democracy of material goods, there were an infinite number of possessions to be purchased by rich and poor alike. There was no need to change institutions because the system was already perfect. It was called the American Dream, and happiness was just one possession away.
Our young adults, and the shopping centers are built in their image. Selling to young adults demands a new kind of marketing. For these young adults, the shopping centers have built fountains, commissioned statues, put in restaurants, and freestanding stairways. They've included banks, loan offices, rental plans, plant nurseries, and places to buy building materials. The shopping centers see these young adults as people whose homes are always in need of expansion. People who buy in large quantities and truck it away in their cars. It's a big market.
In the tinsel and glitter world of Beverly Hills, superstars reign supreme in million-dollar mansions that hold a weird fascination for everyone else. Visitors rubberneck for hours just for a glimpse through the guarded gates. But for one man already on the ladder to superstardom, just a look wasn't enough. For him, it was love at first sight.
We just had, at the time of this filming, it was just a few days ago, there was an incident at a Walmart in Long Island the day after Thanksgiving where basically people were lining up for a sale, 5 in the morning, and one of the workers there was crushed to death, was actually trampled to death by these shoppers. And when the ambulance arrived or whatever it was to take the poor guy to the morgue or the hospital or wherever they're going to take, they didn't want to get out of the way. They said, we've been waiting here for 5 in the morning. I'm not leaving. So that would be the consumer society at its finest. And oddly enough, exactly to the day 5 years ago, on that day, the day after Thanksgiving, The same thing happened at a Walmart in Orlando. It was not a worker, it was a woman who was shopping there, and she wasn't killed, but she was trampled unconscious, and people wouldn't get out of the way for the medics to take her away. So when you get finally to that point, this is what Marcuse was talking about, and the whole idea of one-dimensional man and so on, was this tremendous emptiness again. And so I'm going to buy things to fill that emptiness up. And then we see the religious power of it, because if the medics arrive basically to take the corpse away or the body of the hospital, and you're not going to get out of the way because you're going to save $50 on a DVD player, that suggests something has gone fundamentally wrong.
Everybody's looking restless. Oh, that's an 8-minute countdown! Bitch, I saw you in the face! What is going on?
I think there's not much difference between assuaging your anxiety by buying things and investing in the American dream. They seem to go hand in hand.
The American dream is a story about how society works. The American dream says that if you work hard, you will succeed.
You know, the bedrock of our economic success is the American dream. It's a dream shared in big cities and small towns across races, regions, and religions, that if you work hard, you can support a family. That if you get sick, there will be health care that you can afford. That you can retire. That you can retire with the dignity and security and respect that you've earned. That your children can get a good education and young people can go to college even if they don't come from a wealthy family.
And so it says we may start off with different positions. There are people who are rich and there are people who are poor, and they're born into different kind of contexts, but the playing field is level. That's the dream. That's the dream of, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. The problem with that is actually at odds with how social mobility works. Social mobility actually is much more based upon class and upon the resources that you have available to you into which you're born.
Hi, I'm Paris Hilton, and you're here for the fit on MySpace. Let's go check out my shoe closet first. So, welcome to my shoe closet. As you can tell, I really love shoes.
Part of those are material resources, and part of those are also cultural resources as well. There are class structures that keep people mostly in their places. There are some slight exceptions to this where there's movement between, one rung and another, but the level of social mobility is remarkably low in the society. And then the American dream is punctuated by these very visible examples in the media that show us people who are poor who are now rich. And now the question is, if those people are rich, if those people have made it, and a vast majority of the people have not, and the major thing that separates them is their own hard work, then the reason that the vast majority of people are where they are is because that is where they deserve to be. You didn't work hard enough. You're not intelligent enough.
The right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Some are smart, some not. Some are successful, some not.
The United States never had mass prosperity throughout its history. It was just a period from 1946 to 1980 where the prosperity was really, it looked like it was just going better and better and better for everybody. And that came after World War II, with the backlog of tremendous earnings from war industry and such. The GI Bill that came in that developed a whole new big professional class and the like. And that lasted till about 1980. Since then, there have been cutbacks in human services, cutbacks in educational opportunities, and greater inequality. Since 2000 to 2008, the inequality between the very rich and the rest of us, that inequality is greater than it's been throughout the 20th century. So we're back to like 1900 in terms of inequality. Everybody just can't make it. Throughout history, the rich have always argued that the poor are the authors of their own poverty. They're poor because they're stupid, they're disreputable, they're hopeless. People are poor because they are paid less than the value that they produce. You need poverty Poverty is needed if you're going to have wealth. The only way a rich slaveholder, a Roman senator, or antebellum plantation owner in the South, the only way they can live in this fabulously luxurious mode is by having slaves who work from crack of dawn down into the night. That's expropriation. That's creating the poverty of the slave or the serf or the worker so that the slaveholder or the lord, the feudal lord, or the plutocrat, the capitalist, can really accumulate wealth.
The idea that human happiness is connected to the immense accumulation of commodities. I think that idea is what is driving development in what we used to call the developed world, is driving development in China, is driving development in India. I think it will increasingly drive development in Africa as well. I think we're starting to see the results of what that means for the planet, when not only the 5% of the American population strives for that, but when increasingly the rest of the world also is bought into that, and you then have to provide the goods and the energy that those goods takes to produce, we're arriving at the kind of exhaustion of the physical planet. The ancient philosopher Confucius, he was asked what he would do if he were ever to rule the state. Someone said, okay, you're in charge of the state, what would you do? And he said a very interesting thing. He said he would, quote, rectify the language. And I think if he was asked that in the modern age, he would say, let me control the media. If you can control the stories, you don't need to have soldiers on street corners to control them. You can control people in their own heads, in their own imaginations. On the one hand, it's really depressing because it's like, how do you then get out of it? Because there's no way you can have control of the media. There's no way you can compete with these stories that are told thousands of times a day through advertising, through programming, through newspapers, through the internet now, through video games, through all kinds of ways. At the same time, the reason I'm hopeful, the reason actually gives me some optimism is that capitalism has to do that. That unless it does that, they know that things will fall apart. So capitalism in that sense is like a house of cards. A house of cards, it has to be constantly held together. We have to be told every single day what this story is. And they have to do it every day because it's unnatural. If it was natural, they wouldn't have to do it. And if they stop, they know that in fact it would fall apart. That actually is the great hope for me. Is in fact the amount of time they have to spend convincing us about the value of this society is in fact what gives me hope that that there's an alternative just below the surface, and that alternative is much more human, much more compassionate, is much more connected to concern for other people, is much more connected to concern for the planet, and that it's being held down by this incredible and relentless propaganda system.
If a decision is made by a centralized authority, it's going to represent the interests of the particular group in power. If power is actually rooted in large parts of the population, if people can actually participate in social planning, then they will presumably do so in terms of their own interests. That's why Madison, for example, and Lippmann, and Bernays, and a whole host of others have argued that we cannot permit the population to participate. Because if they do, they will pursue their own interests, not the interests of the wealth of the nation. If you have centralized power, they'll use it for their own interests. You don't have to read that in a complicated textbook. It should be understandable by any 10-year-old child, and not by educated people, though they have it driven out of their heads, various illusions replacing self-serving illusions. If the population are participants, they'll serve their own interests. Public opinion is very well studied. So we have wealth of information about what the public wants. And there's a huge disconnect between public opinion and public policy. The public and policymakers differ enormously on crucial issues. It's all very natural. It's nothing surprising about it, and people understand it. So about 80% of the population in the United States says that the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves.
What do you mean by democracy? If you mean by democracy a system that accepts that the relative distribution of power and influence and wealth and income in the society is sacrosanct. If the social system we call and know as capitalism is inviolable, and you can't, in fact, erode or undercut the primacy of that class's power and property politically, then you've just ruled out democracy. The founders had a very clear idea that in order for political power to be democratic and to be equal, economic power also had to be democratic and equal. Okay? And that was the last thing they wanted. So they saw clearly that behind political democracy was economic democracy. Behind political equality was economic equality. And they did everything they could to block it.
The claims of mind control are based on a belief that human beings are powerless or relatively powerless when they become the targets of psychological operations and propaganda. Media control, yeah, it has an impact on public opinion, without a doubt. It has an impact on the assumptions that people bring to trying to figure out what to do in their lives. It's powerful, but it's not the same as mind control. I think the best way to stop propaganda is for people to understand what it is and how it works. I don't think we're going to stop propaganda so long as we have freedom of speech. And frankly, I think that's a good thing for us. But there will always be people who exploit freedom of speech for their own ends. But propaganda loses its effectiveness if people understand what is going on. A very important thing that can be done to reduce the power of propaganda is to force the players to the surface, so that where you have campaigns, political campaigns, product campaigns, cultural campaigns that are organized by big propaganda agencies, public relations agencies, then part of the task for people who are observing this going on is to make this public, make it understood that what's appearing on the front page of the Washington Post, for example, really is a propaganda or public relations campaign that's coming from a particular faction of society who are paying for it, and that they have names.
It depends on what people believe, what people perceive, what people know. And for a democracy to really function and thrive, unlike Eddie Bernays, I would say what we need is more information, more freedom, more transparency, and more information about who's manipulating public opinion and the public mind. Eddie Bernays believed that fundamentally people were unable to govern themselves in a democracy because most of us were just too dumb to figure it out. And so he used that to justify his practice that he exalted of managing and manipulating public opinion. I think actually what we need is a lot more exposure and education about how public opinion is managed and manipulated, so that we have a citizenry that can actually function and be critical thinkers and decision makers and govern ourselves in a democracy. Clearly, individual and public opinion is crucial to everything. As long as you can manage and manipulate public opinion, or as Burson Marsteller likes to put it, public perception, you can control public behavior and policy. That's what Eddie Bernays knew. That's what he was saying when he talked about engineering consent. And so, yeah, I believe that the ultimate battlefield really is in the mind.
Psychological warfare. This term conjures up dark images of lies and brainwashing. It's a shadowy and little understood part of military operations, equal parts creative artistry and analytical science. Trained soldiers create manipulative messages in secret and then release them for mass consumption. Many believe these words and pictures unfairly convince decent people to betray their friends and their country. But the value of persuasion in times of conflict has been recognized for thousands of years. The ancient Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu, who wrote The Art of War over 2,000 years ago, said, "One need not destroy one's enemy. One need only destroy his willingness to engage." In modern warfare, psychological warfare specialists use leaflets, loudspeaker broadcasts, and radio messages in hopes that the pen will be mightier than the sword. Although persuasion is impossible to measure precisely, it appears that these compelling arguments, along with conventional firepower, have helped save countless lives while shortening wars. Lying in order to irrefutably brand your enemy as evil and deserving of destruction has always been tempting. But surprisingly, psychological warfare's most successful ingredient has actually been the truth.
Let's not be mistaken. Psychological warfare is manipulation. But it is manipulation that's based to the maximum extent possible on the use of truth. Because in the long run, that is going to determine whether or not your message is credible. Because if you're caught out in a lie, the credibility of your message, and therefore of your organization, is going to be severely eroded.
Today, the United States is recognized as the world leader in military psychological warfare. Here at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, teams of U.S. Army soldiers are constantly refining their complex skills and creating messages aimed at a variety of audiences. Mobile production units and armed loudspeaker teams train to deliver these messages to the most remote and dangerous parts of the world. All of these duties fall under the larger umbrella of psychological operations, as their objectives extend well beyond the battlefield.
We have people every day down in Latin America supporting neighboring countries in counter-drug operations. We also work with refugee control. We deploy to support humanitarian relief missions. But when we've been in the operations where we do have combat, we've been there right alongside with the other combat forces.
This challenging field contains many specialties. Communications that are intended to raise the morale of Allied troops or friendly civilian populations are known as cohesive. Those designed to lower your opponent's morale are divisive. Strategic messages reach general audiences far behind the front lines and focus on long-term results. But the primary mission of psychological warfare specialists is to lower the morale and decrease the efficiency of the enemy soldier on the immediate tactical battlefield. And persuading the enemy to surrender is the ultimate challenge.
Battlefields are terrifying places, and they're usually occupied, no matter how well trained the soldiers are, by terrified people. And so trying to insert messages to induce them to surrender or to desert or just to give up and walk away from the battlefield is a terribly difficult thing to do.
Just as in advertising, understanding the target audience of a particular message is critically important. Civilian analysts who've devoted their careers to studying the history and culture of a particular country or region of the world help the soldiers shape their messages, which are also known as propaganda. More current information can also come from intelligence agents behind enemy lines and by interrogating prisoners of war. Pooling these secretive resources provides the best chance for words to be stronger than bullets. But even minor mistakes in the world of psychological warfare can carry disastrous consequences.
And some of the biggest embarrassments in the history of psychological warfare have come about because the person or the organization attempting to persuade another audience made some really big goofs because they didn't understand the idioms, the language.
For example, in the Persian Gulf War in 1991, Iraqi leaders were anxious to try and lower the morale of American soldiers who were fighting in a strange land thousands of miles from home. A female Iraqi broadcaster, nicknamed Baghdad Betty, tried to appeal to the predominantly male American troops.
Baghdad Betty had suggested that while they were in the desert, their wives and sweethearts were at home sleeping with all sorts of movie stars, ranging from Mel Gibson to Bart Simpson. They clearly didn't know Bart Simpson was a cartoon character.
The modern systematic use of psychological warfare began to emerge during World War I. Some messages were floated across the lines tied to small balloons, but airplanes provided a more accurate way of dropping leaflets on the enemy. The German army was actually the first to distribute leaflets beginning in the fall of 1914 on the battlefields in France. The British were hesitant to respond with similar attempts at persuasion.
You have to remember, psychology, advertising were still in their infancy, and so people thought that interfering with thought processes was almost against God's will, and so they were very suspicious of psychological warfare. The human mind was not as fully understood as it is today.
Lord Northcliffe, who owned the London Times and Daily Mail newspapers, wanted to lead a psychological warfare retaliation. At first, convincing British military leaders was difficult. As one general plainly said, the thing was to kill Germans. But by March 1915, the British began dropping leaflets over the German front lines. Both sides used similar themes, such as portraying the enemy's leaders as self-serving burdens on the common soldier to increase dissension in the ranks. But since the war had degenerated into a stalemate, it was hard for any army to gain a distinct advantage. As the Allied navies constricted the amount of supplies that reached Germany, and as large amounts of men and materiel from America arrived in France in 1917, the tide of war began to turn. The morale of Allied soldiers began to rise while the Germans' morale continued to sink, making them more vulnerable to psychological warfare. When some captured German prisoners of war revealed that they'd had very little food, American and British propagandists quickly swung into action.
One of the most effective was the food leaflet. It said German prisoners of war received the same rations as American soldiers, and they listed in mouth-watering detail what the American soldier was eating then. And many soldiers come in with this leaflet in their hands.
A clear sign that these words and pictures were successful was the fact that German officers began to punish soldiers for reading Allied leaflets or just for having them in their pockets. Allied victories on the battlefield, combined with continued German supply problems and the eventual ousting of Kaiser Wilhelm, all helped end the war by November 1918. General Erich von Ludendorff, one of the most senior members of the German General Staff, remarked that we were as hypnotized by the enemy propaganda as a rabbit is by a snake. A much lower-ranking member of the German army, a common infantryman, had also paid close attention to the Allies' success in World War I. Propaganda would become one of the cornerstones for his rise to power, the foundation upon which he would build his dream of world conquest. Following the German defeat in World War I, Adolf Hitler marveled at the Allies' successful use of propaganda in his book Mein Kampf. He wrote, "Our soldiers learned to think the way the enemy wanted them to think." Throughout the 1930s, Hitler and his information minister Joseph Goebbels became masters of strategic and political propaganda, both within Germany and on an international scale. But once World War II began in 1939, their focus remained more on civilian propaganda rather than on tactical psychological warfare. The British had dismantled their successful propaganda program after World War I and had to quickly scramble to resurrect their capabilities when World War II began. In the first few years of the war, the British were more willing to use black propaganda, deceptive messages that claimed to come from one country but actually originated in another. A British propagandist named Sefton Delmer played a German radio character that claimed to be making broadcasts from an official German station inside that country. He attacked Churchill and the royal family to attract an audience and gain credibility, but he also subtly criticized the Nazi Party and promoted the idea that it was acceptable for German citizens to disagree with Hitler. Colorful personalities such as Delmer's were common in a field where imaginative thinkers were forced to work in the structured world of the military. The British Broadcasting Corporation, or BBC, was often used to deliver psychological warfare messages, since many German soldiers in France listened to this radio station. As the Germans prepared for a possible invasion across the English Channel in the summer of 1940, broadcasters mockingly offered to teach the invaders English phrases that they might soon need. Examples such as, "I am burning," and "my boat is sinking," were repeated over and over again. The British were employing the truth in these messages, since they did have a system in place to literally set the ocean on fire by releasing and igniting oil offshore as well as on beaches. But what they didn't tell the Germans was that this was only a limited capability, covering a small fraction of England's southern coastline. This was a prime example of what another British propagandist, Richard Crossman, termed selective truth, meaning the truth, but not necessarily the whole truth. Often what was left out of messages was just as important as what was left in. American psychological warriors first saw action during the North Africa campaign in November 1942, where they worked jointly with their British counterparts. In fact, Allied persuasion efforts fell to a hodgepodge group from 4 different agencies in the 2 countries. General Dwight Eisenhower, commander of the North African landings, turned to Brigadier General Robert McClure to sort out the confusion.
He had been the military attaché in London prior to this time. So he knew the British Allies. One of the reasons why McClure was selected as the man for the job, because one of the duties that he had as a military attaché was press relations. It's not because he had extensive background in psychological warfare. No one did.
McClure's men stumbled through much of the North African campaign. Surrender appeals were sometimes dropped on German units that had recently enjoyed several battlefield victories.
If we are losing, I say we're in retreat, then just basically forget about it. If the other side's on a roll, you're not going to have much success. You might as well save your energy and shut down.
By the time the Allies advanced into Italy in July 1943, their psychological warfare efforts had improved. But even when messages were properly prepared and delivered when enemy morale was sufficiently low, failure was still possible. Credibility was essential, as the Allies learned after dropping one particular leaflet. It promised surrendering Germans the same food that American soldiers received, such as bacon and eggs. The Americans weren't misrepresenting facts, but German forces didn't believe that U.S. troops could possibly have access to luxuries like bacon and eggs during wartime. Even though the message was true, it backfired and made German soldiers more suspicious of future Allied persuasion efforts. When General Eisenhower was named Supreme Allied Commander and charged with retaking Western Europe in 1943, he again put Brigadier General McClure in charge of all psychological warfare activities. The man who had fallen into this field by accident had become a true believer in the power of persuasion in combat.
He was able to finally convince the Air Force to dedicate a special squadron to drop leaflets, aerial leaflets. That was not an easy task when the Air Force felt that their primary purpose was to drop bombs that explode, not paper.
Once the Allies established a foothold on the continent in June 1944, their psychological warfare operations swung into action. In addition to dropping leaflets, loudspeaker teams advanced with the frontline troops to deliver messages in German that could be tailored to immediate battlefield situations.
Loudspeaker teams were right on the scene. Some of the most important things they did was to go to bunkers where the Germans were holed up and saying, look, you're surrounded, you have no way of getting out. If you surrender, you'll be treated honorably, and that often worked.
Loudspeakers were also mounted on tanks to offer more protection and to reduce casualties among these specialized soldiers. The Germans tried to persuade Allied soldiers with radio broadcasts and leaflets, but their efforts were mostly ineffective. They were retreating, and their battlefield propaganda often contained awkward English phrases. When they tried to inspire loneliness in American soldiers, they overplayed perceived notions of anti-Semitism in the U.S. by portraying American wives or girlfriends falling into the arms of lecherous Jews. As the Allied advance continued, the American psychological warriors did resort to fictional propaganda in November 1944. In order to counter declining morale, German propagandists dropped a series of encouraging, cohesive leaflets to their own soldiers from a fictional friend known as Scorpion.
So we made duplicate copies of the Scorpion, in which we were saying things like, if your officers don't exhibit sufficient National Socialist zeal, you can shoot them. Well, eventually Field Marshal Model caught on that we were using the Scorpion, and he told his own people to shut down. He said, if you can be made fools that easily by the Americans, then you might as well go out of business.
As the situation became increasingly hopeless and supplies began to run short, more and more German soldiers decided to surrender and live rather than fight and die. The Safe Conduct Pass was the primary message designed to make surrender seem acceptable. This virtual ticket out of the war provided an enemy soldier with specific instructions on how to give himself up.
He needs to know how to surrender, and he needs to be assured that he will not be shot by the other side and that he can surrender safely. And so one of the most effective methods of getting that message across was the Safe Conduct Pass.
Cultural factors were still important, even with this type of straightforward appeal.
The Germans really respected order and discipline and structure. So what actually happened was a leaflet was designed to appear to be an order, and the order was signed by General Eisenhower requesting that they surrender as soon as possible.
The Allies waged an effective psychological warfare campaign in support of more traditional military weapons in Europe. But their counterparts in the Pacific faced an even greater challenge. They would confront a mysterious, often incomprehensible culture in which anything, even death, was more acceptable than surrender. Just as America's conventional forces were caught off guard by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor in 1941, the U.S. psychological warfare specialists were few in number and unprepared to challenge their new enemy. They underestimated the strong indoctrination of the Japanese. Honor and loyalty to the emperor, even in the face of death, were much more important than survival. It was not until they decided to consult Japanese Americans being held in internment camps and had a chance to interrogate some of the early Japanese prisoners of war that they discovered how abhorrent the very word surrender was in that culture.
We really started off on the wrong foot in the Pacific. Our first leaflet was, "I surrender." Well, the Japanese soldier basically does not surrender. So we went over to the second leaflet was, "I cease resistance," or "I take the honorable course."
The process of showing sample messages to prisoners of war or a culturally similar group such as recent Japanese immigrants, and making changes based on their feedback became known as pre-testing. Because of the complexities of the Japanese language and culture, the Americans took the process a step further.
Japanese Americans or actual Japanese POWs who are willing to cooperate with us. We would draw up the leaflets not only to use the correct Japanese terminology, the right cultural forms and so on, but just to get the language correct.
By 1944, the tide of war in the Pacific had turned. The American forces were advancing in a bloody island-hopping campaign against strong Japanese resistance. The Japanese soldiers were running low on food and other supplies, and morale was falling, but still very few surrendered. However, U.S. psychological warriors did have some success. Japanese-American soldiers known as Nisei put themselves in harm's way to make loudspeaker broadcasts to the enemy in Japanese. The Americans also dropped leaflets before and after devastating raids by U.S. bombers. These messages stressed the superiority of American firepower and the futility of resisting.
Telling them, this is what's going to happen tomorrow at 0700 hours. And it happens at 0700 hours. Now, we're going to do it again tomorrow at the same time. And if you'd just as soon not have to undergo that again, here's what you have to do.
Even Japanese Emperor Hirohito reportedly felt the effect of these words and images.
The emperor picked up one in his own imperial palace garden, and which told him when Tokyo was going to be bombed. And he said in an interrogation after the war, after reading this leaflet and seeing Tokyo being bombed in, that Japan was, on its way to losing the war.
Japanese psychological warfare efforts were not as successful. Western style and culture were apparently as foreign to them as their culture was to the Americans. The Japanese also violated one of the most important rules in psychological warfare. Don't insult the enemy soldier you're trying to persuade.
Frequently, our enemies, whether Japanese or Germans, would portray the Americans as cowardly. That's just going to get people's backs up. I mean, that's elementary psychology.
The Japanese leaflets that attempted to make Allied soldiers feel lonely or suggested that their wives or girlfriends were being unfaithful were some of the most sexually explicit leaflets used by any country.
This tended to cause more humor than any drop in morale. And in fact, some soldiers were rather disappointed when these kind of leaflets weren't dropped.
The radio broadcasts by Tokyo Rose also had little effect.
Certain death awaits you over here. And now I'll play for you unfortunate Americans a popular recording.
She may have made some soldiers homesick, but convincing them to stop fighting was a far different matter. By the end of World War II, hundreds of thousands of enemy troops had surrendered to Allied forces, many of them clutching safe conduct passes or other leaflets. Although it was difficult to quantify precisely, the power of persuasion was still very apparent.
Psychological warfare does help save lives on both counts. On the count of the American soldier who isn't going to be killed trying to dig an enemy soldier out of his foxhole or his bunker, and on the other count, the enemy soldier whose life is saved.
Despite their success in supporting combat forces, most American propagandists re-entered civilian life after the war. Again, Brigadier General Robert McClure lobbied for more resources. Some progress was made, but there was still only a handful of trained people in Asia when the Korean War suddenly broke out in June 1950. At that time, J. Woodall Green, a key member of General MacArthur's psychological warfare team in World War II, was still stationed in the Pacific. He hurriedly marshaled his limited assets. The predominantly American United Nations psychological warfare team faced an opponent similar to the Japanese. Just as in World War II, the Americans learned by trial and error. Once the Chinese entered the conflict on the communist side in October 1950, the Americans began to target them as well. South Korean personnel worked with the Americans to make loudspeaker broadcasts, both on the ground and for the first time in the air. Aerial loudspeakers could cover a much wider range and therefore reach a larger audience. But leaflets were still the primary means of influencing the communist forces. Probably the most effective American message of the war was a creative leaflet known as Mr. White Boots. When the war settled into more of a stalemate near the 38th parallel, negotiations began at Panmunjom in 1951 and dragged on for almost 2 years. One of the American propagandists happened to notice something in a picture of one of the chief North Korean negotiators, Lieutenant General Nam Il, in the winter of 1952.
We had a photograph of him striding to the negotiations in these beautiful soft-skin white calf boots. We just put a phrase underneath saying, Mr. White Boots, do you think he cares about you? And another photograph showing a Chinese soldier's boots are rotting away. A number of defectors after this cited as a reason for defecting is their boots were gone.
Like the Japanese in World War II, the North Koreans and Chinese often struggled with the English language. They were especially fond of referring to American leaders as Yankee imperialist running dogs of capitalism. It was not surprising that such language seemed strange and the messages unconvincing to American soldiers. However, some of the communists' ideas did work. With numerous American soldiers already wondering why they were fighting in a Korean Civil War half a world away, the Leave Korea to the Koreans leaflet resonated with many. But once again, even compelling enemy messages did not lead Americans to freely surrender and adopt the North Korean way of life. Following the Korean War, psychological warfare capabilities in America were drastically reduced in the mid-1950s. Once again, U.S. propagandists would be ill-prepared for their nation's next conflict in Vietnam a decade later.
Modern war has become a struggle for men's minds as well as for their bodies. Today,
in 1952, General Robert McClure's years of lobbying finally resulted in the opening of a training center eventually known as the U.S. Army Special Warfare Center at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Besides being a permanent home for the training of psychological warfare personnel, it was also home to the units that grew into the U.S. Army Special Forces. Despite McClure's efforts in the 1950s, U.S. propagandists still struggled to assist the South Vietnamese government in the mid-1960s as the conflict in Vietnam began to escalate. Psychological operations, or PSYOP, became the new, all-encompassing American military term for persuasion efforts aimed at friendly and enemy forces in Vietnam. One reason for this broader term was the fact that more of the propagandists' resources were devoted to winning the hearts and minds of friendly or neutral civilians than in earlier conflicts. The fact that there were two different types of enemy forces, regular North Vietnamese Army soldiers, or NVA, and local South Vietnamese guerrilla fighters, known as Viet Cong, or VC, presented yet another challenge for U.S. psychological warfare specialists. One audio recording in their arsenal of influence that was particularly effective was known as the Wandering Soul.
It exploited the belief among many of the Vietnamese people that once a person is dead, the remains must be placed in an ancestral burial ground, otherwise the soul of that person would forever wander in space aimlessly. This tape consisted of a male voice that was recorded through an echo chamber that represented the soul of a dead soldier.
But in some cases, the recording was actually too persuasive for its own good.
The tape was so effective that we were instructed not to have it played within earshot of South Vietnamese forces because they too were as susceptible as the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese.
Improvements in high-speed presses meant that leaflet output in Vietnam was prodigious. Some units ran 3 presses operating around the clock to print enough leaflets to stretch 100 miles from end to end each day. This level of output and the effectiveness of many of the messages made these production centers targets for the VC in a country where there was no safe haven. Rick Hoffman was the operations sergeant at the regional printing facility in Saigon.
One of the most sincere forms of flattery, I think, is when the opposition thinks you're doing them so much harm that they want to blow you up. And on December 4th of 1966, they got wind that we were producing a leaflet that featured a VC colonel who had defected. A small team of explosives people, clandestine operation, came across the roofs. The explosion was so loud that at the time I was off duty and in my billet, and we heard the explosion 3 miles away.
These photographs show how extensive the damage was. But the leaflets had already been loaded onto trucks before the explosion, and they were delivered on schedule. Using enemy soldiers to actually write personalized messages or make loudspeaker broadcasts back to their own troops was the primary tactic of America's most effective propaganda program in Vietnam. It was known as Chu Hoi, meaning open arms. The Americans and South Vietnamese promoted it as the first step towards a better way of life. They welcomed defectors, fed them, gave them a place to sleep, and even taught them a trade. Sometimes defectors were used immediately after they'd surrendered to influence a battle that was still taking place. Such circumstances called for special quick reaction leaflets. As many as 50,000 leaflets could be delivered by air in an hour's time. Ray Deitch witnessed the power of a quick reaction leaflet on February 24, 1969. The NVA launched an attack near the Ben Hoa Air Base. When South Vietnamese and American troops stopped the NVA attempts to overrun the base and free a large group of their prisoners, the NVA flooded into the village of Tan Hep. The residents fled and a battle ensued.
During that battle, there were 2 North Vietnamese that were captured. One was an officer. Our battalion persuaded him into making a tape broadcast, handwriting a leaflet that would be directed towards the surrounded remaining North Vietnamese forces in the village.
This is the actual leaflet developed that day. It contains personal appeals to some of the man's former comrades by name. His identity has been obscured for security reasons, since he may still face harsh repercussions in Vietnam. The leaflet drops and loudspeaker broadcasts were then combined with American airstrikes.
After about the 5th distribution of the leaflets and the tape, several North Vietnamese soldiers crawled out from the rubble with their arms raised. Soon others followed, and others. And at the end of the day, we had collected 66 North Vietnamese prisoners of war.
The village was recaptured without further loss of life. Most often, the NVA and VC preferred more violent forms of persuasion. They didn't hesitate to kill the civilian leaders of some villages to keep the rest of the people loyal to their cause. They also countered American psychological warfare with lectures to their own troops, which included fabricated horror stories about American treatment of NVA and VC prisoners.
In particular, they said that when they were prisoners of war and were captured, they were not treated humanely, that they were not giving the medical supplies that they were promised. So there were some lies that were told there to the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers, so they would not defect.
In spite of these efforts to counter American propaganda, 196,000 enemy soldiers, mostly VC, defected through the Chu Hoi program by war's end in 1973. The cyclical pattern of U.S. psychological operations falling into decay after major conflicts was finally broken in the 1980s. when President Reagan drastically increased military spending. By the time American troops were sent to Panama in 1989 to oust Manuel Noriega, psychological warfare had been integrated into the battle plan from an early stage. The psychological warfare image most people remembered from the 1989 invasion of Panama was Manuel Noriega being tormented by American loudspeakers playing rock music. This occurred in December 1989 while he was taking refuge in the Vatican's embassy building in Panama City, known as the Papal Nuncio. But what most people didn't realize was that American psychological warriors had a different objective in mind.
Our primary mission with the rock music was not to blast Noriega, although it was a positive side benefit. But our primary mission was to protect the sensitive negotiations that were going on at the gate from being eavesdropped by the press.
The music worked on both levels, and Noriega eventually surrendered without a fight. Little did these soldiers imagine that Operation Just Cause would merely be a well-run test for a larger conflict just a few months away in the hot sands of the Middle East. Following the success of psychological operations in Panama, more American military leaders were willing to incorporate persuasion into their battle plans at a fairly early stage of the Persian Gulf War in 1991. Intelligence sources also indicated that the morale of conscripted Iraqi soldiers was expected to sink rapidly once fighting began.
If we do have to go to war, the psychological operations are going to be absolutely a critical part of any campaign that we must get involved in.
Advanced planning allowed American psychological warriors to test their messages beforehand. Since there were no prisoners of war yet, Kuwaiti soldiers were used as the closest sample group. Once again, the complexities of a foreign culture quickly became evident.
A lot of them couldn't figure out what a thought bubble was, because that's just not a common thing, apparently, in that part of the world. And another thing that we found out pretty early was that for some reason they didn't generally correlate what would be on the front of a printed product to what was on the back. So our entire book was pretty much invalidated.
Changes were made, and Saudi Arabian illustrators were also used to make the drawings appear more authentic and familiar to Iraqi soldiers. Since Iraqi radio broadcasts portrayed the Americans as barbaric, invading infidels, a decision was made to promote the unity between the Iraqis and other Arab countries in the coalition forces. But the most successful means of conveying this brotherhood made many Westerners uncomfortable. A drawing with an Iraqi flag and a Saudi flag pictured two men walking into a desert sunset holding hands. Some of the American forces thought two men holding hands implied much more than brotherhood. But the message was very effective, since heterosexual men frequently hold hands in many Middle Eastern cultures. When coalition forces began the aerial bombing campaign in January 1991, leaflets emphasizing their overwhelming force were dropped. As in previous conflicts, promising destruction, then delivering it was effective. Just as intelligence reports had indicated, Iraqi morale plummeted and many soldiers surrendered even before the ground campaign began. When loudspeaker teams advanced with the ground forces on February 24th, the number of surrendering Iraqi soldiers became almost overwhelming.
I don't know how many, it could be 1,000, it could be 2,000 prisoners that surrendered just to our loudspeaker team. They told us that some of them had been hiding their leaflets since the first day that they got them, We got some intelligence from these folks that the Iraqi officers were taking everything white away from the soldiers so they couldn't surrender.
Broadcasts and leaflets instructed the Iraqis to avoid destruction by abandoning their equipment. Safe conduct passes also provided detailed information on how to cease resistance and promised good treatment for prisoners of war. Since many Iraqi soldiers had little to eat after enduring 5 weeks of incessant bombing, messages that emphasized food were created to capitalize on Iraqi hunger. POWs who said that bananas were a rare delicacy in Iraq probably didn't think they were revealing anything important. But American psychological warfare specialists used this tasty bit of information to create a very compelling leaflet. Bananas were prominently displayed in a bowl being offered by coalition forces to Iraqi soldiers in what was known as the Arab Feast message. Iraqi psychological warfare efforts were far less effective. They repeated many of the same mistakes that American opponents in earlier wars had committed, such as portraying U.S. soldiers in a cowardly and insulting manner. In the end, the combination of overwhelming coalition force, low Iraqi morale, and effective messages created a unique situation in the Gulf War.
It's been the benchmark for the use of PSYOP ever since. This is because more Iraqi soldiers surrendered than were killed. And so Desert Storm stands as a central example of the effectiveness of psychological operations.
But if the surrender of over 86,000 Iraqi soldiers in Desert Storm renewed Western faith in psychological warfare, the 1999 Balkan conflict in Kosovo raised question marks once again. Propagandists from member nations of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, drenched the region with over 100 million leaflets after Serbian forces invaded the predominantly Muslim province of Kosovo. 70 million more leaflets were delivered in the Balkans than in Desert Storm. NATO also conducted an effective bombing campaign. But without the threat of advancing ground troops, soldiers in Slobodan Milosevic's army could not be persuaded to surrender during the conflict. This served as a potent reminder that psychological warfare alone cannot win wars. Still, this shadowy art of influence continues to evolve.
When the history of the 20th century is written and it's noticed that psychological warfare has been a part of every confrontation, the lesson for the 21st century is that it will remain a key instrument of combat situations on battlefields.
Training goes on at the U.S. Army Post in Fort Bragg, North Carolina, home of the 4th Psychological Operations Group. The psychological warfare specialists constantly hone their skills, developing messages with advanced computer graphics, reproducing them on high-speed presses, delivering messages in the field, or using satellite feeds or the internet to disseminate them around the world.
Striking that balance between the traditional principles and methods and media that we've evolved over the years, and also at the same time trying to adapt to the information age. That's the principal challenge.
Another challenge that psychological warfare practitioners will have to overcome is the negative image of their craft. For all of its successes over the years, many people still see this field as little more than underhanded mind control.
Psychological warfare has always rested as an uneasy activity in democracies, even in wartime. Much secrecy still surrounds its practice. And I think it's partly to do with the suspicion that using the mind to influence the mind is somehow unacceptable. But is it more acceptable to shoot somebody's brains out than to persuade that brain to drop down their weapon and live.
Battlefield psychological warfare will remain an attractive option since it helps save lives. It's also less expensive than most conventional weapons systems. But influencing potential enemies during peacetime may be even more important.
Certainly, if we can prevent the combat or the war or the battle from occurring before it starts, there'll be a big advantage there to everyone involved.
Sun Tzu, the ancient Chinese military strategist, recognized the power of persuasion in preventing conflicts when he said, "To win 100 victories in 100 battles is not the acme of skill. To subdue the enemy without fighting is the supreme mark of excellence."
Subversion is the term, if you look in a dictionary or criminal code to that matter, usually is explained as a part of activity to destroy things like religion, government system, political, economical system of a country. And usually it's linked to espionage and such romantic things as blowing up bridges, sidetracking trains, cloak and dagger activity in Hollywood style. What I'm going to talk about now has absolutely nothing to do with the cliché of espionage or KGB activity of collecting information. So the greatest mistake or misconception, I think, is that whenever we are talking about KGB, for some strange reason, starting from Hollywood movie makers to professors of political science and quote-unquote experts on Soviet affairs, or Kremlinologists as they call themselves, they think that the most desirable thing for Andropov and the whole KGB is to steal blueprints of some supersonic jet, bring it back to Soviet Union and sell it to the Soviet military-industrial complex. It's only partly true. If we take the whole time, money, and manpower that the Soviet Union and KGB in particular spends outside of USSR border, we will discover, of course there are no official statistics unlike with CIA or FBI, that the espionage as such occupies only 10 to 15% of money, time, and manpower. 15% of the activity of KGB. The rest, 85%, is always subversion. And unlike a dictionary of English, Oxford Dictionary, subversion in Soviet terminology means always a destructive, aggressive activity aimed to destroy the country, nation, or geographical area of your enemy. So there's no romantics in there, absolutely. No blowing up bridges, no microfilms in Coca-Cola cans, nothing of that sort. No James Bond nonsense. It's most of this activity is overt, legitimate, and easily observable if you give yourself time and trouble to observe it. But according to the law and law enforcement systems of the Western civilization, it's not a crime. Exactly because of misconception, manipulation of terms. We think that subverter is a person who is going to blow up our beautiful bridges. No. Subverter is a student who comes for exchange, a diplomat, an actor, an artist, a journalist like myself was 10 years ago. Now, subversion is an activity which is a two-way traffic. You cannot subvert an enemy which doesn't want to be subverted. If you know history of Japan, for example, before 20th century, Japan was a closed society. The moment a foreign boat comes to the shores of Japan, the Imperial Japanese Army politely tells them to get lost. And if American salesman comes to the shore of Japan, let's say 60 or 70 years from now back, and says, oh, I have a very beautiful vacuum cleaner for you, with the good financing, he says, please leave us, we don't need your vacuum cleaner. If they don't leave, they shoot them to preserve their culture, ideology, traditions, values intact. You were not able to subvert Japan. You cannot subvert Soviet Union because the borders are closed. The media is censored by the government. The population is controlled by the KGB and internal police. With all the beautiful glossy pictures of Time magazine and Magazine America, which is published by the American embassy in Moscow, you cannot subvert Soviet citizens because the magazine never reaches Soviet citizens. It's collected from the newsstands and thrown to garbage can. Subversion can be only successful when the initiator, the actor, the agent of subversion has a responsive target. It's a two-way traffic. United States is a receptive target of subversion. There is no response similar to that one from United States to the Soviet Union. It stops halfway somewhere. It never reaches here. The theory of subversion goes all the way back 2,500 years ago. The first human being who formulated the tactics of subversion was a Chinese philosopher by the name of Sun Tzu. 2,500 years BC. He was an advisor for several imperial courts in ancient China. And he said, after long meditation, that to implement state policy in a warlike manner, it's the most counterproductive, barbaric, and inefficient to fight on a battlefield. You know that war is continuation of state policy, right? So if you want successfully to implement your state policy, and you start fighting, this is the most idiotic way to do it. The highest art of warfare is not to fight at all, but to subvert anything of value in the country of your enemy, until such time that the perception of reality of your enemy is screwed up to such an extent that he does not perceive you as an enemy, and that your system, your civilization, and your ambitions look to your enemy as an alternative, if not desirable, then at least feasible. Better red than dead. That's the ultimate purpose, the final stage of subversion, after which you can simply take your enemy without a single shot being fired, if the subversion is successful. This is basically what subversion is. As you see, not a single mentioning of blowing up bridges. Of course, Sun Tzu didn't know about blowing up bridges. Maybe there were not that many bridges at that time. But the basics of subversion is being taught to every student of KGB school in USSR and to officers of military academies. I'm not sure if the same author is included in the list of reading for American officers, to say nothing about ordinary students of political science. I had difficulty to find the translation of Sun Tzu in the library of a university in Toronto and later on here in Los Angeles. But it's a book which is not available. It is forced to every student in USSR. Every student who is taught to be dealing further in his future career with foreigners. What subversion is? Basically, it consists of 4 periods, time-wise. If we start from here and go this way, time, right? This is the beginning point. The first stage of subversion is the process which is called, basically, demoralization. It says for itself what it is. It takes from, say, 15 to 20 years to demoralize a society. Why 15 or 20 years? This is the time sufficient to educate one generation of students or children. One generation, one lifetime span of a person, a human being, which is dedicated to study, to shaping up the outlook, ideology, personality. No more, no less. Usually it takes from 15 to 20 years. What it includes? It includes influencing, or by various methods, infiltration, propaganda methods, direct contacts, doesn't really matter. I will describe them later. Of various areas where public opinion is formulated or shaped. Religion, educational system, social life, administration, law enforcement system, military, of course, and labor and employer relations, economy. Okay? 5 areas. I will not write them down because we will not have enough space. Sometimes when I describe all the methods, students ask me question, are you sure this is the result of the Soviet influence? Not necessarily. You see, the tactic of subversion, about which I'm talking, is similar to the martial art, the Japanese martial art. If some of you are familiar with that tactic, probably you will remember that if an enemy is bigger and heavier than yourself, it would be very painful to resist his direct strike. If a heavier person wants to strike me in the face, it would be very naive and counterproductive to stop his blow. The Chinese and Japanese judo art tells us what to do. First to avoid the strike, then to grab the fist and continue his movement in the direction where it was before, right? Until the enemy crashes in the wall. You see? So, what happens here? The target country obviously does something wrong. If it's a free democratic society, there are many different movements within the society. There are obviously, in every society, there are people who are against this society. They may be simple criminals, ideologically in disagreement with the state policy, conscientious enemies, simply psychotic personalities who are against anything. Right? And finally, there are a small group of agents of a foreign nation, bought, subverted, recruited. Right? The moment all these movements will be directed in one direction, right? This is the time to catch that movement and to continue it until the movement forces the whole society into collapse, into crisis, right? So that's exactly the martial art tactic. We don't stop an enemy. We let him go. We help him to go in the direction we want them to go. Okay? So, on the stage of demoralization, obviously there are tendencies in each society, in each country, which are going to opposite direction from the basic moral values and principles. To take advantage of these movements, to capitalize on them, is the main purpose of the originator of subversion. So we have religion, we have education, we have social life, we have power structure, we have labor relations, unions, and finally we have law and order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay? These are the areas of application of subversion. What it means exactly? In case of religion, destroy it, ridicule it, replace it with various sects, cults, which bring people's attention, faith, whether it is naive, primitive, doesn't really matter. As long as the basically accepted religious dogma is being slowly eroded and taken away from the supreme purpose of religion, to keep people in touch with the Supreme Being. That serves the purpose. Therefore, replace accepted, respected religious organizations with fake organizations. Distract people's attention from the real faith and attract them to various different faiths. Education. Distract them from learning something which is constructive, pragmatic, efficient. Instead of mathematics, physics, foreign languages, chemistry, teach them history of urban warfare, natural food, home economy, your sexuality, anything, as long as it takes you away. Okay? Social life. Replace traditionally established institutions and organizations with fake organizations. Take away the initiative from people. Take away the responsibility from naturally established links between individuals, group of individuals, and society at large, and replace them with artificially, bureaucratically controlled bodies. Instead of social life and friendship between neighbors, establish social workers institutions. People who are on payroll of whom? Society? No. Bureaucracy. The main concern of social workers is not your family, not you, not social relations between groups of people. The main concern is to get the paycheck from the government. What will be the result of their social work doesn't really matter. They can develop all kind of concepts to show to the government and to the people that they're useful. Okay, away from the natural links, power structure. Okay, the natural bodies of administration, which are traditionally either elected by people at large or appointed by elected leaders of society, are being actively substituted by artificial bodies. The bodies of people, groups of people, whom nobody elected. Never. As a matter of fact, most of the people don't like them at all, and yet they exist. One of such group is media. Who elected them? How come they have so much power? Almost monopolistic power on your mind. They can rape your mind. But who elected them? How come they have a nerve to decide what is good and what is bad for the elected by you, president, and his administration? Who the hell are they? Spiro Agnew, who was hated by the liberal left, called them a bunch of enfeebled snobs. And that's exactly what they are. They think they know. They don't. The level of mediocrity. In a big establishment like New York Times, Los Angeles Times, major television network, you don't have to be excellent journalist. You have to be exactly a mediocre journalist. That's easier to survive. There's no competition anymore. You have your good, nice income, $100,000 a year. That's it. Whether you're better or worse doesn't really matter anymore. As soon as you're smiling to the camera and do your job. That's it. No more competition. Power structure slowly is eroded by the bodies and groups of people who do not have neither qualification nor the will of people to keep them in power, and yet they do have power. Okay. Together with that, there is another process. Law enforcement, law and order organization and structure is being eroded. For the last 20, 25 years, if you see old movies and new movies, you can see that in new movies, a policeman, an officer of the United States Army looks dumb, angry, psychotic, paranoid. A criminal looks nice, kind of, well, he smokes hash and shoots the whatever drug, but basically he's a nice human being. He's creative. And he's unproductive only because society oppresses him. Whereby a general of Pentagon is always, by definition, a dumb, a war maniac. A policeman is a pig, rude policeman. He abuses his power. You know? A generalization like that. the hatred, the mistrust to the people who are supposed to protect you and enforce law and order. Moral relativity. The Angelo Buono process lasted 2 years in Los Angeles. Relativity. The Angelo Buono process lasted 2 years in Los Angeles. And yet there are still some lawyers who say, look, he's a nice character, as a matter of fact. There was some witness who said, also a criminal, who said, well, he's a nice guy. I asked him one day to burn a house of my enemy, and he wouldn't do it. He's a nice fella. Erosion. A slow substitution of basic moral principles, whereby a criminal is not a criminal, actually. He's a defendant. Even if his guilt is proven, there is still a doubt to kill or not to kill, to be or not to be. Thou shalt not kill, yes, but this line may not necessarily be applicable to a murderer. Thou shalt not murder, that should be the presumption, not that thou shalt not kill. Okay, labor relations. At this stage, within 15 to 20 years, we destroy the traditionally established links of bargaining between employer and employee. The classical Marxist-Leninist theory of natural exchange of goods. A person A has 5 sacks of grain and person B has 5 pairs of shoes. And the natural exchange without money is when they bargain between each other. And only with the introduction of the third force, C, an entirely third foreign stranger who says, no, don't give him 5 sacks of grain, give it to me, and you give me your 5 pairs of shoes, and I will distribute it accordingly, so that the economy will go. This is the death of natural exchange, death of natural bargaining. Well, trade unions were established 100 years ago. The objective was to improve working conditions and to protect the rights of workers from those employers who were abusing their right because they had more money. Objectively, at that time, initially, the trade union movement did work. What we see now is that the bargaining process is no longer resulting in the compromise, which is leading objectively to betterment of working conditions and increase of salary. What we see is that after each prolonged strike, the workers lose. Even if they have 10% increase of their salaries, they cannot catch up due to inflation and due to missed time. More than that, millions of people suffer from that strike because economy now is interdependent. It's intertwined like one body. If previously steel workers, say 100 years ago, could strike and nobody would suffer, now it's impossible anymore. If a garbage collector strikes today, the rest of the multi-million city is stinking. I mean, there's no more service. In Quebec, for example, we had the electricians who were on strike in the middle of winter. You can freeze your bottom, and they still were on strike. Did they catch up with the salary? No, they lost. Who benefited? The leaders of trade unions. What is the motivation for strike? Improving of a workers' condition? No, obviously it's not. Then what is it? Ideology. To prove to these capitalists. And the obedient horde of workers, like sheep, follow these people. And they cannot disobey. Why? Because if they do, you know what happens to them. Pickets, murders, shooting truck drivers by picketers. In Montreal, for example, I saw with my own eyes when I was correspondent of CBC, International, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, when the workers of aircraft factory destroyed computers and the equipment in the factory. And the administration employed strike breakers. Their cars were turned upside down and burned. Their houses were burned. Their kids were intimidated. And some victims were there. Of that you can be sure. Why? To improve conditions of workers? No. Ideology. Okay, so this is what happens basically.
It may or may not happen without the help of the Soviet Union. But the natural tendencies are being greatly taken advantage of and capitalized by the Soviet propaganda systems. How? Whenever trade union strikes, we have influx of propaganda, mass media, ideological dissemination. The workers' right, and we repeat it like parrots. Yes, workers' right. Whose rights? Workers? No. The only freedom of worker to sell his labor according to his own desire and will is taken away from him. By whom? By trade union boss. Unlimited power is given. Responsibility. I want to sell my labor not for $2.50 an hour, but for $2. I don't have right. My freedom is denied to me. I know that if I sell my work for $2 an hour, not for $3 an hour, I will compete better with the other guy who is lazy and more greedy. I don't need $3. I need only $2. No, I was made to believe by media, by business, by advertising agencies that I need more and more and more. Have you ever heard any advertising on TV to consume less? No. No way. Whether you need a six-cylinder car or not, you have to buy it. And hurry up. When I was driving here on the local radio station, an excited announcer said, "You hurry up, rush and save, save, save. There is a pantyhose sale." Save by buying more. Of course, of course. It would be too naive to expect that KGB makes that advertising agency to do such a crazy commercial. No, of course not. But what we did when I was working for Novosti Press, we would snow plow editorial offices, student organizations, religious groups with literature of class struggle, if not directly Marxism-Leninism propaganda, then a propaganda of the legitimate aspirations of working class, betterment of life, equality. Equality, mind you. President Kennedy once said, we will make America to believe that people are born equal. Are people born equal? Is there any mentioning in the Bible or any other holy scripture in any religion, if you don't believe me, go to the library and check it. There is not a single word about equality. Just the opposite. By your deeds, God will judge you. What you do is important. The merit of your personality. You cannot legislate equality. If you want to be equal, you have to be equal. You have to deserve it. And yet we build our society on the principle of equality. We say people are equal. We know it is false. It's a lie. Some people are tall and stupid. Others are short, bold, and clever. If we make them equal by force, if we put the principle of equality in the basis of our socio-political structure, it's the same thing as building a house on sand. Sooner or later it will collapse, and that's exactly what happens. And we, as Soviet propaganda makers, are trying to push you in the direction which you go yourself. Equality, yes, equality. People are equal. Land of equal opportunities. Is it true or not? Think about it. Equal opportunities. Should there be equal opportunities? For me, and for a lazy bastard who comes here from some other country and immediately registers as a welfare recipient, benefits. I never received a single dollar. No, sorry, I did receive once. But I never applied for welfare. For the 13 years, I took any job. Security guard, journalist, taxi driver, anything. Well, I was restless, but some people don't like it. They immediately. So why should we have equal opportunities? Why?
The equal opportunity to excel.
Equal opportunity in equal circumstances, yes, but we know people are different. To excel, yes, provided we reach the same level of excellency, perfection, which is hypothetical, distant future. Yes, maybe. But we know perfectly well that even with the best intentions, people could not be equal. Why should we have equality in the, say, legal system? Myself, I'm considering myself a law-abiding citizen, and a person who comes here to rob and shoot, say, the United States administration under Carter imported thousands of Cuban criminals. They were non-criminals, yet they were accepted. Do you think it's fair if myself and my wife from Philippines, who work like a, excuse me, horse as a lab technician in a hospital, should have the same rights as a criminal from Cuba? Why? And yet we repeat as parrots, equality, equality, equality. And the Soviet propaganda system helps us to believe that equality is something which is desirable. Democracy, as it was established by fathers of this country, of this system in the last century, is not equality. It's the system where different people, unequal people, have a chance to survive and help each other in constant competition, in constant perfection, not in equality, which is superimposed from a godfather or a nice person in Washington, D.C. And the absolute equality exists in Soviet Union, quote-unquote equality. Everybody is equal in dirt, except some people are more equal than the others in Politburo. So, the moment you bring a country to the point of almost total demoralization, when nothing works anymore, when you are not sure whether it is right or wrong, good and bad, when there's no division between evil and good, when even the leaders of church sometimes say, well, violence for the sake of justice, especially social justice, is justified in the countries like Nicaragua, El Salvador, well, maybe Rhodesia, and we listen to them and say, yeah, probably it's true. Is it true? No, it is not true. Violence is not justified, especially for the sake of quote-unquote social justice introduced by Marxist-Leninists, that is my former colleagues from Novosti Press Agency. Okay, so we reached that point. The next step is destabilization. Again, this word says for itself what it is. To destabilize all the relations, all the accepted institutions and organizations in a country of your enemy. How you do it? You don't have to send a battalion of KGB agents to blow up bridges. No. You let them do it themselves. The area of application is, again, it's narrower now. Not like the previous case. The overt legitimate actions of the KGB in this case would be hardly noticeable. There is no crime if a professor who recently went to USSR introduces a course of Marxism-Leninism in a Californian college, for example. Nobody is going to come to his doorstep and say, okay, mister, come, you are under arrest. No, it's not a crime. It's not even considered a moral crime against your country. So the area of application here is narrowing down to economy, again labor relations, right? To law and order, plus military. And economy, law and order. Yes, and again the media, but wider scope, little bit different. I'll explain later. Okay, basically 3 areas. Economy. The radicalization of bargaining process. If on that stage we still could achieve, theoretically, some positive compromise between the negotiating sides with say, the arbitrary, introduction of arbitrary judges, a third side, objectively judging the demands of both sides. Here it's radicalization. On the stage of destabilization, we cannot come to compromise even within a family. The husband and wife couldn't figure out which is better. Husband wants his kids to eat at the table, and wife wants a child to roam around the room and drop food all over the floor. They cannot come to compromise unless they start a fight. It's impossible to reach a compromise, constructive compromise, between neighbors. Some people say, I don't like you to watering your lawn at that time because exactly at that time I'm walking my dog and he's getting nervous and he cannot pass his bowels, you know. So they cannot compromise. They go to a civil court or something like that. Radicalization of human relations. No more compromise. Fight, fight, fight. The normal, traditionally accepted relations are destabilized. The relations between teachers and students in schools and colleges. Fight. The relations in economical sphere between laborers and employers are further radicalized. No more acceptance of the legitimacy of demands of workers. Unlike Japanese, with the theory Z, if you ever heard about it, where the workers are involved in the decision-making process, therefore they don't have moral incentive to fight their bosses. In the United States, it's just the opposite. The harder is the fight, the better. The more heroic they look. When the Greyhound network was on strike recently, the correspondents of local TV networks all over the United States were approaching these strikers, and they say, oh yes, we are doing something nice. They look like heroes and they were proud. There was some family, the husband was a bus driver. Now they decided in a protest against the bosses to camp somewhere in the forest. And they were presented to the audience as a heroic, nice people. You see? The violent clashes between passengers, picketers, and the strikers are presented as something normal. 10, 15, 20 years ago, we would be angry, say, why so much hatred? Today we are not. We say, well, it's commonplace. Radicalization, militarization sometimes. As I explained on that stage, I took a step a little bit further. Shooting people. Okay, law and order now also is pushed into the area where previously people settled their differences peacefully and legitimately. Now we are getting with this court cases in the smallest irrelevant cases. We cannot solve our problems anymore. The society at large becomes more and more antagonistic between individuals, between groups of individuals, and the society at large. The media puts himself in the opposition to the society in general, at large. Separate, alienated. Okay? On that stage, you remember I was talking a couple of hours ago about the sleepers. That's when the students from, say, United States, if they are trained in Lumumba University, or developing nations, that's the students I was dealing with, are being sent back from the Soviet Union here. Or if they were already in the United States, in the country, which is an object of subversion, they spring to action. The sleepers go up. They slept for 15 to 20 years. Now they become leaders of groups, preachers, I don't know, public figures. Prominently they actively include themselves in a political process. All of a sudden we see a homosexual. 15 years ago he did his dirty job and nobody cared. Now he makes it a political issue. A political issue. He demands recognition, respect, human rights, and he rallies a large group of people. And there are violent clashes between him and police, his group and ordinary people, no matter what. It's black against white, yellows against green, doesn't matter where the division line goes. As long as this group come into antagonistic clash, sometimes militantly, sometimes with firearms, that is destabilization process. The sleepers, many of whom are simply KGB agents, become leaders of the process of destabilization. Doesn't mean that Comrade Andropov sends Comrade Ivanov to the United States. The person who takes care is already here. He is a respected citizen of the United States. Sometimes he gets money from various foundations for his legitimate struggle for, I don't know, human rights, women's rights, kid lib, prison lib, whatever. There are sympathetic Americans who donate their money to him. This stabilization process usually leads directly to the process of crisis. In case of developing nations, that's the area where I was active. The process starts when the legitimate bodies of power, the social structure collapse. It cannot function anymore. So instead, we have artificial body injected into society, such as non-elected committees. You remember I was talking about them here. Social workers who are not elected by people, media who are self-appointed rulers of your opinion, some strange groups which claim that they know how to lead society forward. They don't usually. All they care is how to collect donations and sell their own concocted ideology, mixture of religion and ideology. Here, we have all this artificial body claiming power. If the power is denied to them, they take it by force. In case of Iran, for example, all of a sudden we have revolutionary committees. What kind of revolution? There was no revolution yet, and yet they had the committees. They were taking power of judgment. They had the power of execution, they had the power of legislation, and that they had the power of judicial. All of them combined in one person, who is half-baked intellectual, sometimes graduated from Harvard University or Berkeley. He comes back to his country and he thinks that he knows the answer to all the social, economical problems. Okay? Crisis is when society cannot function any more productively. It collapses, obviously. That's the word for crisis. So therefore, the population at large is looking for a savior. The religious groups are expecting a Messiah to come. The workers say, we have family to feed. Let's have a strong government, maybe socialist government, centralized. When somebody put the employers on their place and let us work. We are sick and tired of going to strike and missing overtime and all that stuff. We need some strong man, strong government, a leader, a savior is needed. Population is sick and tired already. And here we are. We have a savior. Either a foreign nation comes in, or the local group of leftists, Marxists, no matter what they call themselves, Sandinista, a reverend or some sort, Bishop Muzureva, like in Zimbabwe, doesn't matter. A savior comes and says, I will lead you. So we have two alternatives here. Civil war and invasion. Okay? See how it goes? Civil war, we know what it is. Lebanon is the best example. The civil war, which was artificially implanted in Lebanon by injection of force of PLO, Palestinian Liberation Organization. Invasion we have in many other countries like Afghanistan, name any East European country, it was invaded by the Soviet army. But the result is the same. The next stage is normalization. Normalization is a very ironic word, of course. It is borrowed from 1968 situation in Czechoslovakia, when the Soviet propaganda and after them New York Times declared the country is normalized. The tanks moved into Prague, so there's no more Prague Spring, there's no more violence, normalization. At that stage, the self-appointed rulers of the society don't need any revolution anymore. They don't need any radicalism anymore. So this is the reverse from destabilization. Basically, it is stabilizing the country by force. So all the sleepers and activists and social workers and liberals and homosexuals and professors and Marxists and Leninists are being eliminated physically sometimes. They've done their job already. Okay? They are not needed anymore. The new rulers need stability to exploit the nation, to exploit the country, to take advantages of the victory. Okay? So no more revolutionaries, please. And that's exactly what happens in a number of countries. You remember Bangladesh? This is the crisis in which I was instrumental. First they had Mujibur Rahman. In 1971, he was the leader of People's Party, Awami League, with mustache like Stalin. He was in Russia many times. In 5 years, he was shot by his former colleagues, Marxists. He fulfilled his function. In Afghanistan, it happened 3 times. First there was Taraki, then there was Amin, now there's Babrak Karmal. They killed each other successively, one after another. The moment he fulfills his duty, the first one demoralized country, the second destabilized, the third one brought it to crisis. Goodbye, comrades. Babrak Karmal comes from Moscow and put into the seat of power. Same thing happened in Grenada recently. Maurice Bishop, Marxist, was killed by Austin, what's his name, General something, who was also a Marxist. Right? So no more revolutions, please. Normalization now. From now on, no more strikes, no more homosexuals, no more women lib, no more kid lib, no more lib, period. Good, solid, democratic, proletarian freedom. That's it. Now, to reverse this process takes enormous effort. When today, United States had to invade Grenada to reverse the process of subversion. Some people say, boy, this is not good, it's not kosher to invade the beautiful country, island of Grenada. Well, why didn't you stop the process here, when Grenada was just approached by leftists? Why not to prevent Maurice Bishop to come in power in the first place? Did Grenadians want him? Very questionable. They didn't know who was Maurice Bishop in the first place. He came to power by coup d'etat himself. Okay? No, we let the situation develop further and further and further until the crisis and normalization very soon. And then the United States decided to invade country, discovering that the country was absolutely a military base for the Soviet Union. Of course it's a drastic measure. Of course it's a pity that Marine Corps had to lose, what, 17 lives. Very bad. Why not to stop the process before it comes to crisis? Oh no, intellectuals will not let you. It's interference into domestic affairs. They're very careful not to let American administration to interfere in domestic affairs of Latin American countries. They don't mind Soviet Union interfere in these affairs. Okay. So to reverse this process, from here, it takes only and always military force. No other force on earth can reverse this process at this point. At this point, it does not take military invasion of the United States Army. It takes strong action, like in Chile. A CIA covert involvement to prevent the savior from outside to come into power and to stabilize country before it erupts into civil war. Country before it erupts into civil war. Okay? Support the right-wing conservative forces. By money, by crooks or love, doesn't matter. Stabilize the country. Don't let the crisis develop into civil war or invasion. Oh no, your liberals will say it's against the law The Congress will not appropriate money for covert actions of CIA. Why not? Should we wait till the normalization come and Soviet tanks land in Los Angeles airport? Now, at that point, at the point of destabilization, also the process could be reversed. Again, easily than this. No CIA involvement at this point. You know what it takes here? Restriction of some liberties for small groups which are self-declared enemies of the society. As simple as that. Oh no, the media and liberals will tell you this is against the American Constitution. How can we, by force, deny the civil rights to criminals, for example? It's not good. Okay? So we allow them to. Okay, if you allow the criminals to have civil rights, go on and bring the country to the crisis. This is a bloodless way to do. Curb the rights. I mean, not to put them in prison. No, I'm not talking about putting all the gays from San Francisco in the concentration camp. Do not allow them to take political force. Do not elect them to the seats of power, whether it is municipality level, state level, or federal level. It has to be beaten in the heads of American voters that a person like that in the seats of power is an enemy. Do not be afraid of this word. It is an enemy. If he is not an enemy here, he will be here. Later on, he will be shot, of course. But at this point, he is an enemy. Okay? You are doing great service by denying him a right to capitalize on his own crazy ideas and become a powerful man, a man who uses the seat of power. Restriction of certain freedoms and permissiveness at that point would prevent sliding into crisis and probably will return the process of destabilization. To curb unlimited power, monopolistic power of trade unions, here, at that point, would save economy from collapsing. To introduce a law to stop private companies of raping public opinion's mind in the direction of consumerism. No company must have a right to force you into buying more unless you want it. There must be a law. You want to advertise your car? Okay. But not a single mentioning of buying it now and saving money. It must be against the law to force people to consume more. Self-restraint. Previously, before this process started, the self-restraint was a business of church, religion. Because our preachers, the fathers of church, would tell us, material values are good, but it's not the prime function of human being. Because you have to live with something. Obviously, the design for our life is not to consume more deodorants. There must be something greater. If such a complicated instrument as human body was created, obviously there must be some higher purpose for that. And it's very easy to avoid destabilization by denying the greedy companies one little freedom, one little liberty, forcing you into turning yourself into processors of unwanted products and goods. They turn you into machines, like the worm who there's inlet and outlet. So, and how long an average appliance lasts these days? Less than a year. Why? Where's workmanship? Well, we want you to buy more. Okay. Destabilization process could be easily overcome if, as I say, the society, by its own will or after persuasion by the leaders, will come to the idea of self-restraint. It's so hard we want to consume more, but you have to. Unless you will come to this stage, when, as we say in Russia, if Sahara Desert ever becomes a communist state, there will be shortage of sand. So you have to curb your... You have to curb your expectations at this point before it's too late. But no, we don't want to do it. Demoralization process. Again, it's the easiest thing to reverse. First of all, by restricting import of propaganda. The easiest thing to do. Unlimited, unrestrained import of Soviet literature, Soviet journalists, giving Soviet propaganda and ideological agitators equal time on American TV networks. It has to be stopped. And it's easy. They won't be offended, mind you. As a matter of fact, they will respect America more. But when my former colleague Vladimir Posner appears on Nightline and Ted Koppel asks him, well, Vladimir, what do you think about this? And what can he think? He is an instrument of propaganda. He thinks what Comrade Andropov tells him to think. He's just a nice, articulate mouthpiece of the Soviet subversion system. And Ted Koppel makes you believe that my friend Vladimir Posner thinks the process of demoralization may not have started at all if at that point the country, which is a recipient of subversion, actively, not violently, but actively, prevents importation of foreign ideology. I don't want America to follow the pattern of ancient Japan. You don't have to shoot every foreigner when it approaches the sacred borders of the United States. But when he offers you a junk in the disguise of very shiny something, you have to tell him, no, we have our own junk. If at that point the society is strong, brave, and conscientious enough to stop importation of ideas which are foreign, then the whole chain of events could be prevented. Recently I've been to Philippines, and I was shocked how in big cities like Manila, children listen to deafening music. A melodious nation with long traditions of good, nice ethnic music, introduced by Spanish long time ago, maybe 2 centuries, 3 centuries ago, I don't remember how. All of a sudden listen to musical garbage, blasting their radios at full blast, at full volume. Why? In India, I spent many years watching the reactions of Indians walking out of movie theaters after seeing Hollywood production. They couldn't figure out why Americans are so wasteful. They smash their cars, their shiny cars, every 5 minutes. How come they shoot each other for $500,000? Is it true that they're so obsessed with sex? Can you imagine showing a movie where each 5 minutes there's a copulation on the screen to a country like India with long tradition of respect to these private matters, or to Pakistan? And United States expect these people to respect you? No way. Oh yes, they will see the movie, they'll pay 5 rupees to see that garbage, but they walk out and will tell their kids, don't respect Americans, don't be like Americans. See? So, the process of demoralization could be stopped right here, both as an expert and as an import. And that takes one step, one very important thing to do. You don't have to expel all the KGB agents from Washington, D.C. The most difficult and at the same time the simplest answer to the subversion is to start it here and even before, by bringing back the society to religion, something that you cannot touch and eat and put on yourself, but something that rules society and makes it move and preserve it. A Soviet scientist, Shafarevich, who has nothing to do with religion, he is a computer scientist, did a very intensive research on the history of socialist countries. He calls socialist or communist any country with a centralized economy and a pyramidal style of power structure. And he discovered, actually he didn't discover it, he just brought to attention of his readers, that civilizations like Mohenjo-Daro in the river Indus area, like Egypt, like Maya, Incas, like Babylonian culture, collapsed and disappeared from the surface of Earth. The moment they lost religion, as simple as that, they disintegrated. Nobody remembers about them anymore. Well, distantly. So, the ideas are moving society and keeping mankind as society of human beings, intelligent, moral agents of God. The facts, the truth, the exact knowledge may not. All the sophisticated technology and computers will not prevent society from disintegrating and eventually dying out. Have you ever met a person who would sacrifice his life, freedom, for the truth like that? This is truth. I never met a person who said, this is truth and I'm ready to shoot me. To defend the truth. Right? But millions sacrifice their life, freedom, comfort, everything for things like God, like Jesus Christ. It's an honor. Some martyrs in the Soviet concentration camp died. And they died in peace, unlike those who shouted, "Long live Stalin," knowing perfectly well that he may not live long. Something which is not material moves society and helps it to survive. And the other way around. The moment we turn into 2 by 2 is 4 and make it a guiding principle of our life, our existence, we die. Even though this is true, and this we cannot prove. We only can feel and have faith in it. So the answer to ideological subversion, strangely enough, is very simple. You don't have to shoot people, you don't have to aim missiles and Pershings and cruise missiles at Andropov's headquarters. You simply have to have faith and prevent subversion. In other words, not to be a victim of subversion. Don't try to be a person who in judo is trying to smash your enemy and being caught by your hand. Don't strike like that. Strike with the power of your spirit and moral superiority. If you don't have that power, it's high time to develop it. And that's the only answer. That's it.
Thank you.
Wake up to reality. Nothing ever goes as planned in this accursed world. The longer you live, the more you will realize that the only things that truly exist in this reality are merely pain, suffering, and futility. Listen. Everywhere you look in this world, wherever there is light, there will always be shadows to be found as well.